Welcome to the Drowsy Historian. Tonight, drift back into the heart of the Middle Ages, where behind towering gray stone walls and beneath timber-bird ceilings, a different kind of that rarely made it into the storybooks. We often think of castles as grand places of knights, kings, and banquets. But tonight, you'll walk in the worn shoes of those who were never seated at the feast, the servants. In the quiet darkness before dawn, a young servant stirs from a bed of straw, her blanket threadbare. The chill of the stone floor already seeping into her bones before her feet even touch it. There are no birds chirping yet, no rosy sunlight slipping through the arrow slits. Only the echo of a distant iron bell, 3 slow tolls that mean it's time to rise. She groans softly, not from laziness, but from the stiffness in her spine and legs after yet another night on a shared cot. Her name isn't recorded in any chronicle, but her life kept the entire castle functioning. She pulls on a rough-spun woolen tunic, its hem fraying, and slips her swollen feet into wooden clogs that clatter against the stairs as she makes her way down to the kitchens. There's no time to stretch or yawn. A fire must be lit before the noble family stirs, and there's ash to clear from yesterday's embers. The stone walls are damp with dew, the cold sharper than the knives she will soon be scrubbing, and her breath rises like smoke as she kneels to stoke the flames. This is where the day truly begins. The kitchens of a medieval castle are not cozy places. They're cavernous, often windowless, filled with smoke and soot. The air thick with the scent of old grease, barley, and dried herbs hanging from the beams. The hearth, wide enough for a man to stand inside, has not been hot in hours. She uses a pair of iron tongs to shift the blackened logs, her fingers already raw, the splinters unnoticeable in the steady rhythm of labor. There are cauldrons to be filled, barley to be soaked, roots to be chopped, and bread dough to be shaped. And she is just one of many. Over in the scullery, another servant, a boy no older than 10 pumps water from the castle, muscles trembling as he hauls the heavy buckets up slippery steps. 2 others prepare to fetch firewood, walking half a mile to the nearest forest edge, hoping to avoid wolves and bitter winds. Meanwhile, the chambermaids begin their rounds upstairs. Their job, often misunderstood, is less about plumping cushions and more about hauling chamber pots, brushing hair full of lice and scrubbing sweat-stained linens by hand. One particularly dreaded task is cleaning the garderobe, the castle's version of a toilet, a chute built into the outer walls. It smells worse in summer, but winter has its own curse, the icy seat. The maids take turns, faces turned away, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing with ash, vinegar, and sand. Their hands crack and bleed. But gloves are a luxury they do not have. As the sun begins to rise, thin light spills into the main hall where the lord and lady will dine. But before they can, everything must gleam. The trestle tables are wiped down with damp rags. The rushes on the floor swept and replaced with fresh straw, sometimes mixed with lavender or chamomile, if available. Soot must be brushed from the fireplace. Tapestries shaken out in the courtyard, and dogs ushered out from beneath benches where they've curled up. The head servant, often called a steward, oversees it all. Unlike the rest, he has a better cloak, a cleaner tunic, and perhaps his own room. But even he is under pressure. If the morning's meal is late or the fire is not warm enough for the lady's chamber, punishments will come. For now, he checks on the cook, who is barking orders at 2 trembling boys as they pluck feathers from a pair of fowl. There is no rest yet. No one has eaten, but food is everywhere, in barrels, on hooks, in pans, and none of it is for them. Servants rarely eat when hungry. They eat when allowed. The daily rhythm of castle life depends entirely on the invisible hands of the servants. From sunrise to long after nightfall, they climb ladders to dust beams, polish armor that isn't theirs, wash blood from the stones after hunts or fights, and do it all with bowed heads. Their reward? A bowl of pottage, perhaps with a sliver of salted pork if lucky, and a corner of a floor to sleep on. Their names were not carved into marble or preserved in tapestries, but they were there every day, lighting the fires, drawing the baths, tightening the corsets and carrying the burdens of the stone fortress above them. Even in the dead of winter, when breath turned to frost and bones ached with cold, they labored on. And so, as the noble family stirs and the first boots click across the great hall floor, the servant girl stands back in shadow, smoothing her apron, hair still damp from morning mist. No one will notice her, and that is the point. A good servant was meant to be invisible. But if she stopped for even an hour, the entire castle would fall into silence and shiver. Tonight, as you fall asleep, remember that history's grandest halls were built not just with stone and wealth, but with the quiet strength of those who rose each day to serve within them. The girl steps aside just as the castle steward passes through the kitchen archway, his boots echoing like warnings against the stones. His brow is furrowed and his eyes dart to every corner looking for anything out of place before the lord descends from his chambers. The lady of the house, not yet awake, sleeps on a feather-stuffed mattress beneath imported linens. On the floor nearby, the maid had dozed curled like a cat the night before, ready to wake instantly if summoned. For spilled wine, a cook might lose a week's meal. It's also a song. In the late evenings, once the nobles dine and retreat, the lower hall sometimes hums with quiet laughter. A boy hums a tune while sweeping straw, a laundress sings as she wrings out linens, and two grooms joke while brushing down horses in the stable. These moments are rare and fleeting, but they carry a warmth no hearth can offer. The cook is feared for her temper and her knives. In summer, the kitchens become ovens, with grease from roasting meat slicking the floors and turning the air thick with flies. They fetch the perfumed oils for the lady's hair. They buckle the lord's armor before battle and clean it, bloodied, after. Their stories were not inked in manuscripts nor painted into murals. But tonight, under the hush of history and the quiet hum of memory, we honor them. The bell may toll, the frost may bite, but in the stillness of night, the servant rests, knowing she will rise again. Not because she wants to, but because the castle cannot afford for her not to. They keep the chapel swept, the banners mended, the chamber pots emptied. No matter how grand the halls or glorious the feasts, the work never stops. Behind every goblet lifted in toast, there's a trembling hand that filled it. During spring, illnesses spread fast through shared sleeping spaces. Through unwashed hands, through the rats that skitter across pantry shelves. Some sleep beneath stairwells, others atop hay in the stables. Their dreams are not of riches, but of warmth, of shoes without holes, of dry hands in days without beatings. They rarely see the stars, the walls are too high, and when they do, it's only when running water, or whispering prayers through arrow slits, wondering if God hears servants at all. And in autumn, the castle hosts visiting nobles, which means more mouths, more messes, more pressure, and more eyes watching for errors. Chambermaids are looked down upon by laundresses, who are mocked by scullions, who in turn kick the dogs beneath the tables. A hierarchy exists, subtle and cruel, mimicking the nobility above. But among the youngest apprentices and errand boys friendships bloom. They steal apples together, hide during storms, and fall asleep whispering stories of knighthood, knowing well they'll never see armor. It is in these snatched minutes between scrubbing and hauling, fetching and fearing, that the servants remember they are human. For eavesdropping or backtalk, a servant could be dismissed without wages. Carpenters, blacksmiths, and stable boys all work in tandem with indoor staff. A servant might be sent down to the market before sunrise, navigating muddy paths to bring back fresh herbs or cloth scraps, often paying from their own pocket and praying not to be short on change. If a noble cloak goes missing or a chicken escapes the coop, blame falls without question on the lowest link. Worse still were punishments hidden from noble Vulock storerooms, icy corridors, lashes behind closed doors. There's no dining hall for servants, only corners. A bowl of pottage, thin and watery, made with barley, cabbage, or onions, if lucky. Meat is rare, unless it's a feast day or leftovers are granted. Bread is coarse and dark, sometimes crawling with weevils. Still, they eat quickly, grateful to be fed at all. Conversation is hushed, interrupted often by a bell, a boot step, or a command barked from across the room. There are stories whispered among the kitchen hands of a maid who dropped a necklace and was made to scrub the latrines with her bare hands for a month. No one ever asks why she disappeared after that. She begins the day by emptying the lady's chamber pot into the garderobe, rinsing it with a ladle of cold water from a ceramic jug. Her fingers are numb, her sleeves damp, but this is her station. A spoon on the edge of a pot, a smear of lard on a work table, a cinder where it shouldn't be each is a mark of failure. Trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as plates are stacked neatly. Jugs of watered wine and ale are checked and poured. A slab of yesterday's venison is sliced and laid beside poached eggs, boiled in vinegar to keep them firm. No one speaks unless necessary. The air is too tense, too still, as if even the stones are holding their breath. It is a strange kind of silence, a silence born not from peace, but from fear. His voice is calm but sharp, like a blade sheathed but ready. Keep the fire even, no soot in the broth. And wipe that floor again? He doesn't thank her, nor does she expect it. Upstairs, another world stirs. A chambermaid gently opens a wooden shutter in the solar, letting pale light fall across the polished surface of a chest. In the great hall, servants rush to prepare the Lord's morning meal. Discipline within castle walls is a constant threat. For a broken jug, a scullion might be slapped. And yet, the castle is not just stone and punishment. Outside, the outer bailey bustles with even more activity. Meals are taken standing or crouched near the hearth on a bit of sackcloth. There are ranks even among servants. The steward answers directly to the Lord, while the marshal oversees horses. The seasons bring their own miseries. In winter, water freezes in the buckets before it can be poured. Still, the castle cannot function without them. Servants light the braziers that warm the noble toes. And when night finally comes, and the torches are extinguished, and the castle slumps into silence, the servants retreat to their corners, aching and blistered. This was the life of the invisible majority within every stone fortress. Chapter 2, The Castle Shadow, a kitchen maid story. The drowsy historian invites you deeper now, not just into the routines and rhythms of castle life, but into the shadowed footsteps of one young woman, whose name is lost to the records, but whose labor built a very heartbeat of her lordess household. Alice came to the castle not as a choice, but as a necessity. Her father had died in a distant harvest accident, and her mother, too frail to work, had secured her a place in the kitchens through a favor owed or a coin slipped to the steward. Iron cauldrons boiled noisily, their contents sometimes splashing onto the floor and searing the skin of any servant too slow to dodge. Allie's was burned twice, once by oil that leapt from a skillet, once when she leaned too close to a spit-roasted boar. Servants could disappear. One morning, the boy who had swept rushes in the great hall was simply gone. Whispers said he'd stolen dried pears and was sold off to a merchant in Bristol. Her perfume smelled of violets. She did not glance down. That day, Allie's had scrubbed her chamber pot. Later, she washed the lady's bloodied linens, evidence of another lost child, and said a prayer over them. Not for the noblewoman, but for the child who would never know what it was to sweat, to toil, to survive. Another time, a scullery girl who had broken a ceramic pitcher vanished without a trace, and her fingers tingled with cold even beside the fire. The steward told her to rest for a day. She is the ghost in every hearth, the shadow in every corridor, the hand behind every dish set on a noble's table. As you close your eyes tonight, remember her not as a ghost, but as a girl who survived the crushing silence of servitude and still managed to find the strength to rise. Day after day, in the castle's shadow. She was never promoted, there was no clear path for servants, but she was trusted. Moreau gave her more to do. Once, Alice was even permitted to serve a dish to the high table. Perhaps she married a stable hand and moved to a nearby village. Perhaps she caught a fever and was buried behind the chapel. Perhaps she fled during a feast, when the guard was drunk and the gate was ajar. There's no record. Only echoes in the stone and a dent in the scullery table where her elbow once rested during brief moments of stolen rest. She kept her head bowed and did not breathe too loudly. But for a brief moment, she stood in candlelight, surrounded by music, finery, and conversation. Then the dish was gone, and so was she. Moreau scowled but sent her to lie in the flower storeroom, where the air was dry and the mice respectful. She saw the cook weep just once when news came of her brother's death in a distant war. She buried a kitten that had lived in a pantry. She learned that silence was armor and that laughter was rebellion. Her hair grew long. Her hands grew strong. She was never asked what she wanted from life. No one in the castle ever did. Another girl brought her broth. It was the kindest moment she had known since arriving. That girl's name was Ellen, and they remained friends through glances, whispered jokes, and shared scraps of cheese stolen from platters. Alice wondered if she'd fallen asleep in the wrong place or said the wrong thing at the wrong time. And no one dared ask. You did not question absence. You simply filled the space they left. She didn't cry either time. She had learned that crying marked you as weak, and weakness was not protected here. Alice once watched a minstrel from the doorway of the hall, her hands still red from gutting fish as he played a soft tune on a rebec. For a few heartbeats, the room faded. Her pain dulled. She saw a life she might never have. Another time, while picking herbs in the walled garden, she stood very still and let a robin perch on the handle of her basket. It cocked its head and sang a few notes before fluttering away. She said nothing to anyone. It felt like a secret meant just for her. At night, she would steal a smear of goose fat to soothe her wound and curl near the chimney's base, soaking her sleeves with sweat and smoke, while trying to sleep with her head against a sack of onions. She was 12 then, wide-eyed, hungry, and terrified. To the servants, she was simply a terror. But Alice understood something others didn't. Moreau had once been a maid herself. Her hands, thick with old scars and freckled from the hearth, moved with brutal precision. Her voice snapped like firewood. But late at night, when all the dishes were done and the meat salted and stored, Moreau once handed Alice a stale roll and said, "You lasted longer than your sister did." Alice had never mentioned a sister. The cook had looked her up and down without warmth, handed her a rag, and told her to scrub the scullery floor before the lords returned from hunting. That was the extent of her welcome. No one asked if she had eaten. She hadn't. That night, her stomach growled louder than the wolves in the woods beyond the outer gate. If you closed your eyes and walked through a 12th century English castle, her presence would be everywhere and nowhere at once. Never acknowledged in the feasting hall, never painted into the margins of noble family trees, but ever moving, ever needed. Her life was not written in, but in burns, in blisters, and in bruises hidden beneath coarse sleeves. She was one of the countless kitchen maids who began her day in the dark and ended it with aching legs, grease-streaked cheeks, and the stubborn scent of onions embedded into her fingertips. Her name might have been Alice. That is what we will call her. The scullery was her world. It sat at the far end of the kitchen, near the castle well, where water was drawn and dishes were cleaned. Alice learned quickly how to sort the bowls from the trenchers, how to remove bone fragments from the cracks of wooden spoons with a stiff bristle brush, and how to keep quiet when the cook was in a foul mood, which was often. She used ash and sand as scrub, scraped hardened drippings from roasting pans, and carried buckets of wastewater out to a corner where pigs snorted and crows gathered. Her hands were always wet, her nails peeled. Her palms developed calluses where the skin used to be smooth. The castle kitchen was a roaring place. Fires crackled in multiple hearths. The cook's name was Moreau. To the noble family, she was mistress of the kitchens, and her roast goose had once pleased a visiting duke. There were quiet dangers in the castle, ones not mentioned in the steward's orders or the ladies' songs. And still, there were moments, tiny, glowing fragments, when the shadows lifted. The lady of the castle, adorned in rings and velvet, once passed Alice in the corridor. One winter, Alice grew ill. Her legs trembled, her breath rasped. Alice grew taller. She learned to roast partridges, to slice apples so thin they dried like parchment, and to recognize the sound of noble boots versus guard boots. Years passed. Alice watched others come and go. She saw a night die of fever. Her story ends not with glory, but with vanishing. Alice may be gone, but she was real. The days for alleys had long blurred into one another's seasons, changing not by calendar, but by the temperature of the scullery floor and the ingredients that showed up in the baskets hauled in. From the gardens or the market beyond the castle gates. From behind the kitchen doors, she could hear the minstrels tuning their lutes, the noble guests laughing too loud, the clink of goblets raised in toast. She imagined the way the roast goose must gleam under candlelight, how the marzipan figures would shimmer like jewels. The scent of rosemary on those days, the entire castle hummed like a beehive struck with a stick. Allie's and the other kitchen hands worked until their feet went numb, preparing sweetmeats and stews, arranging platters of dried fruit, folding linens, and making sure the wine jugs were full. There was the time a cat gave birth under the flour sacks, and Allie spent an hour petting the tiny kittens, their eyes not yet open. There was a spring morning when the orchard trees bloomed all at once, and the air smelled sweet as honey, and even Moreau didn't shout for a whole hour. The lady's hair turned silver, and she seldom left her chamber. The kitchen was to ration flour and preserve more food. Her touch was on the worn stones, her sweat in the mortar, her breath in the air. She pulled her thin blanket around her shoulders and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would come early. The coals would need stirring, the bread would need kneading, and she, as always, would rise before the first bell tolled. No record bore her name, but her labor lingered in the polished wood, the clean cauldrons, the warm bread served at the high table. She might never leave, never be thanked, never be remembered by the world beyond the castle walls. But here, in this harsh and hidden place, she had survived. And sometimes in a world built for others, survival is its own quiet form of defiance. She knew what that meant. Less bread for the servants. More mouths to feed with fewer supplies. Harder days coming. That night she sat alone beside the hearth, the coals red and low. And she wondered how long she would go on like this. How many more dawns she would greet with a sigh, and how many more nights she would sleep without knowing if she had been seen at all. One winter, Moreau grew sick and did not return. A younger woman took her place, less cruel, but more forgetful. Alice found herself teaching others how to manage the oven stones, how to steep the sage, how to make the barley stretch. No one called her mistress of anything, but they listened when she spoke. There was the thrill of sneaking a plum from the pantry, the juice sticky and warm on her chin. These moments stitched her together, thread by thread, even as the work frayed her edges. One of the visiting pages had caught her eye and winked as he passed the open door. She whispered about leaving one day, finding work in a town, perhaps as a seamstress or tavern maid where she could earn her own coin and walk outside whenever she pleased. Alice never said her own dreams out loud. She didn't have words for them, only longings, the feel of soft wool against her skin, the taste of meat not scraped from a pot, a room of her own without smoke, without orders, without fear. Once, during a summer thunderstorm, she and Ellen had huddled in the supply shed, their knees drawn up, listening to the rain thrum against the wooden roof. Ellen spoke of distant lands, and Alice listened, not because she believed it was possible, but because believing didn't hurt. It was such a small thing, but it made her laugh later, alone while cleaning eel bones from a wooden plate, and clothes floating upward to those who never see the faces that toiled for it. There were moments sharp and quiet when the castle itself seemed to turn against you. A nobleman once cornered one of the younger girls in the stairwell. She never said what happened, but her lip was split the next morning, and she avoided the hallways for weeks. No one reported it. There was no one to tell. Power moved downward in heavy boots, and servants bore the weight without question. Alice kept her head down, avoided eye contact with men in polished boots, and learned to make herself small in narrow spaces. Moreau was always at the center of these preparations, barking orders, adjusting platters, checking every dish twice. And Alice, quick-handed and silent, had become her trusted shadow. She was the one sent to gather fresh watercress from the wet garden wall. She was the one tasked with slicing bread evenly for the Lord's personal table. It wasn't praise exactly, but trust, a currency that bought a little safety, a place where everything else could be taken without warning. Summer meant root vegetables would vanish and plump figs might appear, albeit not for her. Autumn was meatier, with salted pork and fowl coming in larger batches, But it also meant longer hours and banquets that left the kitchen in chaos and the servants with barely a moment to eat. Winter, however, was a cruel time. The castle walls grew colder than ice, and even the hearth fires in the kitchen could not fully keep out the biting draft that slipped in through the arrow slits and under the thick doors. Water for the bread had to be thawed over coals. Fingers cracked and split open from the cold. And Alice would often blow warm breath into her cupped hands while scrubbing dishes, her palms raw and stinging. She never saw the feast she helped prepare. The kitchen itself was its own world. There were rules, unspoken but known. You never spoke when the cook was near, unless spoken to. You never wasted food, not even the skin of a boiled onion. You never turned your back to the fire while wearing loose sleeves, and you always covered your mouth when coughing. A single illness could turn the whole castle upside down. Servants were not afforded the luxury of sickness. Fevered hands still had to stir pots. If you collapsed, someone else stepped in not out of kindness, but because the work had to go on. Alice had once worked 3 days with a pounding headache and a stomach twisted from spoiled broth. She said nothing, and no one asked. Sometimes there were visitors for nobles, bishops, merchants, and once even a troupe of Italian performers who danced for the Lord's son's name-day feast. But danger didn't always come from overwork or scalding cauldrons. Despite it all, there were memories she cherished. Ellen, her closest friend, had dreams. Years passed slowly in the kitchen. The noble family aged. The Lord's son, once a child, grew tall and arrogant, shouting at servants with wine-stained lips. One day, a messenger arrived with news. The steward read it aloud in the great hall, but Alice only caught fragments. War, troops mustered, taxes increased. But she also knew something else. She was part of the castle's memory now. As the moon rose and the castle hushed once more, Alice lay down near the hearth. Chapter 3. Latrines, Lice, and Lordship. The drowsy historian welcomes you once more into the lesser-told corners of medieval life, where dignity was not measured in gold, but in survival among stench, sweat, and secrets. Tonight, we explore the grimiest corners of the medieval castle, the latrines that emptied out over moats, the lice that nestled in linens, and the strange nobility that arose even in the ranks of the unwashed. These were not topics sung by bards or embroidered into banners, but they were present in every fortress every day, humming beneath the polished illusion of civility. If castles were machines, these hidden parts were the grinding gears. Let us begin with the latrine, known more commonly than as garderobes. The term may sound elegant to the modern ear, evoking thoughts of tapestries and dressing rooms, but in reality, the garderobe was anything but refined. Built into the outer walls of the castle, these stone-seated toilets were often little more than wooden holes positioned above chutes, which funneled waste into cesspits or directly into the moat. In winter, the stone seat was so cold it could numb a person's thighs in seconds. In summer, the smell was nearly unbearable, especially when the wind blew in the wrong direction. Cleaning these garderobes was the dreaded duty of certain lower tier, usually the newest. The weakest, or those who had fallen out of favor. Armed with scrapers made of wood, buckets of lye, and rags dipped in vinegar, they would kneel for hours inside narrow shafts where the stench clung to the skin and hair long after the task was done. Some garderobes had small shelves beside the opening, where herbs like mint or lavender were left in a desperate effort to mask the odor. These offerings were for the nobles. The servants had no such luxury. They tied claws over their noses, braced themselves, and prayed not to drop anything. In some castles, the waste was collected into cesspits, which had to be emptied periodically. This job was contracted to gong farmers' net workers who carted away human waste and dumped it beyond the castle walls. They were paid reasonably well for the time, but their work was so reviled that many lived in near isolation, feared for their proximity to disease. Yet even these laborers played a vital role. Without them, the castle would have become a disease-ridden death trap. No amount of gold embroidery could keep rot at bay. Lice, meanwhile, were more democratic in their presence. They infested lords and servants alike, slipping through seams and burrowing into hair regardless of social rank. However, it was the servants who bore the daily burden of managing them. Bedding was rarely washed more than once a season. Servants often slept on shared cots or on straw mats, which teemed with bugs and fleas. They combed their hair with bone or wooden combs, if they had one, and washed when possible, usually in cold basins or rivers. Soap, made from animal fat and ash, was scratchy and harsh on the skin. Bathing was not a daily habit, but a privilege, and for many, it was avoided altogether in the cold months for fear of chills or punishment for missing chores. A servant assigned to laundry had perhaps one of the most difficult tasks. Washing required hauling water, boiling it over fire, then scrubbing clothes with stones, lye, or even fermented urine believed to remove stains. The hands of the laundry girls were always chapped, their skin raw, their backs bent over tubs while steam rose and mixed with the scent of sweat and soap. Noble clothing, heavy with embroidery and velvet, took days to dry and was sometimes ruined in the process, leading to the servant being whipped or dismissed. Few tasks offered so much effort with so little praise. Despite all of this, there was a strange kind of pride among the castle's lower ranks. Some servants developed a sense of ownership over their posts. A scullery maid might guard her corner of the kitchen like a lioness. A laundry girl might brag about the whiteness of the lady's veil or the sharpness of her pressed collars. Even the garderobe cleaners sometimes developed a hierarchy of who cleaned what and when. It was not noble pride, but a different kind of fierce assertion of presence in a world that often treated them as invisible. Amid this grime and order, peculiar social dynamics emerged. Certain servants, those closest to the lord or lady, held soft power. The lady's personal maid, for example, knew secrets others could not guess. She had access to the chamber where love letters were written, tears were shed, or plots whispered in hushed tones. The lord's groom, who dressed his master's wounds or sharpened his sword, might overhear political discussions. These servants sometimes wielded silent influence, passing on gossip, managing rivalries, or granting small favors in exchange for loyalty or silence. Disease was another ever-present threat. Typhus, dysentery, and plague could sweep through a castle in days. Servants were always the first to die. Their shared quarters, poor nutrition, and overwork made them especially vulnerable. Doctors were summoned only for the noble family. For servants, remedies included poultices made of garlic, prayers muttered under the breath, or being bled by a rusty knife. Many died nameless, their bodies buried in mass graves outside castle walls, sometimes without ceremony. And yet, every day, others rose to take their place. Amid this relentless hardship, one might wonder why anyone stayed. But for many, there were no other options. The castle, for all its cold stone and cruelty, offered food however meager, a roof, and a place in a structured world. Life beyond the walls meant hunger, exposure, and bandits. Inside, one might live to see another winter. Inside, there were fires, routines, and even sometimes moments of beauty. On feast days, when colored banners flew and trumpets sounded, servants sometimes caught glimpses of a world beyond theirs. From behind doors or beneath stairs, they saw tapestries unfurled, tables groaning with food, nobles in bright garments laughing without care. It was not their world, but they were the ones who built it, cleaned it, and held it up with callous hands. Even as they scrubbed floors or picked lice from one another's hair, they did so with a quiet dignity, a recognition that though history would not remember them by name, the very stones of the castle echoed with their labor. As night falls once more over the castle, the garderobes are empty, the buckets tucked away, the linens hung to dry. In the servants' quarters, bodies curl into corners, exhausted. A girl picks a louse from her arm and flicks it into the fire. Another scratches her scalp and sighs. They do not dream of thrones or tapestries. They dream of warmth, of dry feet, of a day without welts or blisters. And still, in that dreamless sleep, they rest with a strength kings will never understand. When a castle was built, great care was taken to design its walls, towers, and battlements, but rarely did architects devote the same attention to the comfort of those who maintained it. For servants, every corner presented a challenge. Even sleep itself could be an ordeal. In the servant quarters, cramped rooms under rafters or low-ceiling nooks tucked beside storerooms, mats of straw were laid out with little room between them. The straw was often damp, crawling with fleas, sometimes replaced once or twice a year, if at all. Blankets were rough and shared, passed down from servant to servant. When it rained, the roof leaked. When it snowed, frost crept inside. Yet here, bundled close together, the lowest ranks of castle life curled in exhaustion, swatting lice and shivering through nights so cold their breath turned to clouds. Among them was a boy named Tom, no older than 11, who'd come from a village lost in last season's floods. He was taken on as a boot cleaner and errand runner, tasked with fetching coals, polishing metal fittings, and running letters between chambers. He slept beneath the stairs outside the buttery. One morning, a maid found him fevered and still. No one had noticed him missing the day before. The steward allowed him to remain in the storeroom, wrapped in linen, and after 3 days, he recovered. But he never spoke much afterward. He scratched his scalp often, and the kitchen girls helped comb out the lice in silence. No one laughed. In this castle, even children knew shame and duty in equal measure. Infestations were inevitable. The rushes that covered the floors, meant to soak up spills and waste, also hosted mice, fleas, and worse. Sometimes the castle steward ordered fresh rushes, occasionally sweetened with dried herbs like thyme or meadowsweet. This happened more often in the upper levels of the castle where the lord and lady dwelt. For the servants, it was usually only done when the smell became impossible to ignore. Insects crawled across floors, beds, and clothing. Hair was rarely cut, but often tied back or hidden beneath linen taps to reduce the spread. Girls combed each other's heads in the evenings, and boys scratched beneath collars and cursed quietly under breath. There were no real remedies. Lice were as permanent as the stone walls themselves. Bathing occurred only occasionally. There was no true bathhouse inside most castles. When one did exist, it was reserved for the elite. Servants made do with wooden tubs hauled into warm corners, filled with buckets of cold water, sometimes slightly warmed by placing hot stones in the basin. Soap was precious made from leftover lard and ashes. It burned if the skin was cracked, and it left behind a residue that made hair stiff and sour-smelling. Still, the act of scrubbing oneself, even just once a month, was a quiet relief, a symbolic casting off of everything the castle forced upon them. The daily burden of keeping the castle from becoming a disease-ridden ruin often fell on these invisible shoulders. Servants swept the privy tunnels with stiff brushes, tossed lime down the refuse shafts to reduce the stench, and shooed rats from storerooms armed only with sticks and claps. During especially hot summers, when the wind turned rank and tempers flared, the steward would order a full cleaning, windows opened, walls scrubbed, rushes replaced. It was a rare day when the servants were allowed to work in fresh air, though the labor left them heaving and dizzy by dusk. The nobles called it airing the castle. The servants called it a punishment disguised as cleanliness. Even so, a strange sort of order governed all of this. Despite the filth, there were rules. The guardrobes near the chapel could only be cleaned during daylight. The kitchen scullery had to be cleared before meat was butchered. Water from the moat could not be used for washing vegetables. It was often polluted with waste and dead birds. Servants learned these lessons quickly, usually by accident. A young laundress once soaked linens in the moat and was beaten when a rash spread through the steward's bedding. She didn't cry. No one did. Tears were considered a waste of water. In the midst of all this, the line between servant and structure began to blur. The castle wasn't just stone and timber, it breathed through its workers. A servant didn't simply clean the hall. She polished the surface that would reflect candlelight onto the faces of the noble guests. A boy who mucked out the stables was also preparing the horses for war, for marriage processions, for kings and their sons. They were part of the castle's heartbeat, and if one of them fell ill, faltered, or was too slow, the entire rhythm stumbled. It was a brutal system, but it moved with the same inevitability as the turning of seasons. Even so, the castle's hierarchy clung to its pretenses. A noble might suffer from lice, but a servant's infestation was seen as filth. A lord might pass gas at the high table, but a kitchen boy caught scratching was ordered out of sight. The same realities applied to all, but only servants bore shame for them. It was the burden of their visibility, every slip noticed, every smell blamed, and yet they kept going. They made vinegar solutions to clean their hands. They pinched rosemary leaves to rub on their wrists. They placed sprigs of mint in their boots. These weren't rules passed down in scrolls. They were scraps of inherited knowledge, passed in whispers and practiced out of sheer will to endure. There were rumors that in other castles, servants had revolted. A boy in the stables once claimed his cousin had escaped from a northern stronghold and was now working in a monastery, clean and fed. Another said he'd heard of a castle in France where the chambermaids were allowed to wear shoes indoors. These tales were passed like treasures, fragile hopes polished by repetition. None could be confirmed, but none were outright denied either. The very idea that somewhere a servant might be treated with kindness was enough to keep spirits flickering, even if faintly. But dreams didn't last long in a world that demanded constant waking. At dawn, the latrines filled again. The lice returned. The floors grew foul, and the servants, without praise or pause, stepped forward to face it all again. Their reward was not gold or thanks. It was a place in the machine. It was survival. It was a roof, however leaky, over their heads. It was a cold bowl of barley stew at the end of the night. And sometime that was enough. As the castle settled into sleep once more, the refuse pits outside the walls steamed in the cold. Mice darted along rafters. Servants scratched inside and pulled coarse blankets up to chins. In the quiet, one might almost believe the place was peaceful. But beneath the silence, the hum of survival continued rough hands. Aching backs, lice in the sheets, and dignity not granted, but carved out of stone through sheer perseverance. Chapter 4, Segment 1 of Feast for the Nobles. Crumbs for the staff, the drowsy historian invites you now to the loudest, richest corner of castle life, the great hall during a feast. You've seen the paintings and heard the legends, long tables groaning beneath roasted pigs. They were performances of power, held for visiting nobles, marriages, holidays, or political triumphs. Trays had to be wiped free of fingerprints. The highest sat closest to the lord at the head of the table, while lesser guests spilled down the sides. Servants flitted between them, pouring wine, carrying platters, laying down trenchers of bread. After the feast, once the nobles left to retire, dance, or play games, the leftovers were sorted. The best cuts went to favored retainers. The steward and cook ate first. Then the head scullions and senior grooms. Then the laundresses and torchbearers. Victory, he sent a platter down to the servants' hall. A roasted chicken. A sweet tart. A jug of wine. These moments were rare, and when they came, they felt like miracles. Dressed in velvet while your own feet bled through worn leather. Smelling roasted meat while your stomach cramped from hunger. Seeing tables creak under pies and pheasants while you counted the hours until crusts arrived. That ache deeper than hunger was the real burden. And the music faded into memory. The servants remained. Their hands cracked, their feet blistered, their bodies aching. But their work lingered in the air, in the scent of roasted herbs, in the waxy gleam of polished goblets, in the stories nobles told about the splendid meal at Castle Brayton. Lynette once wept after tasting spiced apples for the first time. She said it reminded her of a harvest fair she attended as a child. She hadn't tasted sweetness since. At the very end came the stable boys, the spit-turners, the errand girls. They often got only a spoonful of cold barley and a torn heel of bread. And still, it was better than a day with no feast. Better than famine. Better than being outside the castle walls, where no food waited at all. Some meat was salted and stored. Bread was scraped of gravy and saved for pottage. Fruit cores and fish bones were discarded. What remained, the crusts, the dry ends, the scraps, were placed in wooden bowls and passed down to the servants. Platters were returned, knives washed, goblets scrubbed with sand and vinegar. The rushes on the floor now soaked with wine, gravy, and worse were swept and burned. Dogs had to be driven from under benches. Strange, defiant pride. Allies, who were quietly near the scullery door, once leaned over to Lynette and whispered, "We made that peacock shine like a crown." Lynette grinned, lips stained with berry juice stolen from a discarded tart. For a moment, they weren't servants. They were architects of spectacle, magicians of meat and flour, unseen engines of glory. Spilled wax scraped up with blades. Everything returned to perfect order by morning. By then, most servants had been awake for over 18 hours. They sat in corners of the kitchen, eating in silence, too tired for conversation, grateful for whatever they could get. Their movements were silent, efficient, rehearsed like dancers. A misstep could mean humiliation. A dropped dish might result in a beating. One scullery boy once sneezed during a prayer and was slapped so hard he didn't speak for 3 days. Fresh rushes were scattered across the floor of the great hall. Roasted peacocks served with feathers reapplied for decoration. Pork glazed with honey and mustard. Tarts filled with dates and almonds. Eel pies shaped like fish. Fruits soaked in spiced wine. Baskets of sweet wafers. Dishes molded into the shapes of castles or lions or mythical beasts. There was no end to the indulgence, and for each guest, a servant waited in near invisibility, ready to refill, replace, or clean up at a moment's notice. The long wooden tables were scrubbed with vinegar and sprinkled with mint leaves to freshen the air. Candles were trimmed and set in rows. In some castles, the lord demanded the meat be carved at the table, a theatrical display of mastery and excess. That task fell to a carver, usually a favored servant trained in the etiquette of slicing boar and pheasant in elegant strokes. He stood beside the table like a knight, blade gleaming, movements rehearsed to impress. They required weeks of preparation and an army of servants to bring to life. The Lord Steward oversaw it, all ordering extra barrels of ale and wine, sending riders to nearby villages for wild boar, pheasant, pomegranates, or even imported spices if corn allowed. Meanwhile, the cook coordinated everything from the roasting order to the decoration of sugar-coated fruits. And behind both stood the invisible ranks of laborers, scullions, spit boys, chambermaids, laundresses, torchbearers, and wood haulers, each moving with mechanical precision, each desperate not to make a mistake. Honeyed pears, steaming trenchers, and golden goblets held aloft by flush nobles wearing velvet and gold. Music plays, dogs bark underfoot, jesters tumble and sing, and the Lord raises his voice in a toast that echoes off the high-beamed ceiling. But while the guests feast, let us slip through a small door near the kitchen and down a narrow passage. There, behind the splendor, is a girl crouched beside a hearth, eating a cold crust of bread. Her name is not known. She does not wear velvet. But she helped make the feast happen. And tonight, like every night, she'll only what's left behind. Feasts in a medieval castle were not merely meals. The kitchen on the morning of a feast was chaos in rhythm. Fires blazed under 5 hearths. Iron spits rotated endlessly. Dough was kneaded in massive troughs, chickens plucked by the dozen, barrels rolled across flagstones. A boy named Rafe would spend the entire day turning a spit, his arms locked in motion, face red and streaked with soot. A girl named Lynette stirred a bubbling pot of beans so large she could barely reach the bottom. The cook shouted over the din, sleeves rolled up, sweat trickling down her temples. By midday, the kitchen felt more like a forge than a place for food. Presentation was everything. As the feast began, the hall came alive. Trumpets signaled the entrance of the lord and lady. Nobles took their seats by rank, and the food. But for all the food consumed in the great hall, very little of it ever reached the servants. Hierarchy persisted even among the hungry. Sometimes, when the lord was in a generous mood or celebrating, his servants had to clean up immediately after the feast. There was no rest. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that weighed on them. It was the contrast, watching lords and ladies laugh and feast, and yet there was pride. When the feast was forgotten, when the guests had returned to their manners, they would never be named. But their hands had fed kings. Long after the laughter died down and the goblets had been drained, the feast lived on in the backbreaking labor it left behind. The great hall, once filled with firelight and fragrance, fell into dimness. Candles sputtered in their holders. Bits of marrow-smeared bread lay crushed into the rushes. Somewhere, a dog still gnawed on a bone stolen from beneath the lord's table. His eyes were sharp, but his tone was flat, and she chewed it slowly beside the fire, savoring each bite like a prayer. Next to her, a younger girl gnawed on a crust. The scraps divided, and the floor swept too. A boy told a joke about a nobleman too fat to mount his horse. Perhaps he dreamed of the feast of the laughter, the musicians, the taste of sweet wine, in the muscle memory of the spit boy's arm, in the heat scars on Lynette's wrist, in the brittle nails of the girl who cleaned the trenchers. In Alice's silence as she watched the hall fill and empty, her eyes steady, her hunger quiet, her dignity preserved in the smallest of ways. But he would not remember the faces of the girls who had stirred the custard, or the boy who slipped while carrying a tray, or the hand that had scrubbed his plate clean before it was set before him. And so, at last, did the servants tired, used, but unbroken. That was not his world. His feast was not a burden, but a gift. Another mimicked the way a guest had tried to speak French and failed. A few giggles rose, quiet and breathy, as if laughter itself might be taken away if it were too loud. Someone passed around a bruised apple found under a table. They all took a bite. It wasn't charity, it was survival shared. The last of the servants sat to eat. They didn't gather at a long table. There was no toast, no second helpings. The night deepened. The castle walls held firm against the cold, but the wind still moaned through the gaps. In the servant quarters, blankets were spread out, straw adjusted, aching limbs folded inward for warmth. Alice tucked her arms beneath her tunic and closed her eyes. The smell of roast and wine still lingered in her hair, and her fingers were pruny from hours in the basin. But she'd eaten. Not well, but enough. She would wake tomorrow with the sun, and the memory of the feast would already begin to fade. Another one would come soon. Another day of boiling, butchering, baking, and being overlooked. They sat wherever they could on crates beside barrels, near the warmth of the ovens. They ate with their hands, picking meat from bones, tearing bread with teeth too warm for chewing. The food was cold, the portions small, but they were grateful. Some even smiled, her fingers trembling from cold. The castle felt strangely equal. Lords and ladies might be upstairs in feather beds, but down here, below stone arches and smoke-dark beams, there was a different kind of community, built not on bloodlines, but on shared hunger, shared labor, shared pain. No one here wore rings or gowns, but they carried each other in other ways. When a plate fell, someone helped pick it up. When a girl cried quietly from exhaustion, a hand reached out to steady her. No one asked why. That was just how things worked. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was filled with understanding. This was not a night for words. He pointed out a goblet left unpolished, a linen cloth not yet scrubbed, and then vanished again into his chambers. He had eaten well. His breath had smelled of wine and clove. No one questioned his authority. He'd once been a servant himself, and now he enforced the invisible line between those who dined and those who scrubbed. Some said he was fair. Others said he'd forgotten what it was like to bleed from turning a spit too long. But the guests had gone, drifting into soft beds and silken pillows, while the servants stepped forward like ghosts, silent and efficient, ready to erase the spectacle they had built. No trumpets welcomed them. No songs were sung. Their fanfare was the creak of benches being lifted and the slosh of greasy water slung from buckets. The dishwashing began immediately. Enormous copper pans blackened from the fire had to be scoured with ash and gravel. Carving knives returned with meat still clinging to the joints. Pewter plates, used by the less important nobles, were stacked beside the washing basin, each needing to be scrubbed free of oily sheen. Wooden trenchers were scraped with dull knives, tossed into piles, and repurposed for servant meals or dried for the next day's stew. The air was thick with a mixture of meat, sweat, and smoke. In the scullery, water boiled over low fires. Steam rose and clung to the faces of the girls who leaned over the tubs, sleeves rolled up, hands red and blistered from the heat. Alice worked quietly, her back sore, her mind detached. She had long since trained herself not to hope for more than what came her way. As she washed a silver knife, she glanced out toward the back hall where leftover platters were stacked. Her stomach rumbled, but the order of serving was unshakable. She'd wait her turn, if anything was left. She remembered a feast last spring where nothing had reached the lower staff but bones and barley broth. That night, one boy had fainted while hauling firewood. They said he'd skipped 2 meals. But no one talked about it after. As the cleanup continued, the steward passed through to inspect the work. In the candlelit corners of the kitchen, the division between feast and famine became obvious. Lynette had secured a piece of salted fish once the mess was cleared. In that moment, there were moments of levity. Outside, above her, in a chamber with thick tapestries and a feathered mattress, the Lord turned in his sleep. Yet the truth of it all, the labor, the fire, the pain, was stored elsewhere. When the last candle flickered out and the wind died down, the castle became still once more. The feast was over. The guests slept. Chapter 5: Cold Stones and War Drums. The drowsy historian returns now to the coldest corners of the castle, not just in season, but in spirit. For while most stories of medieval fortresses recall battles won and banners raised, few tell of the ordinary souls left behind to hold the walls when war drew near. Servants were not soldiers, yet when war drums echoed beyond the woods and torches flared atop watchtowers, the weight of violence settled just as heavily on their shoulders. Behind every polished shield, every hauled stone, every boiling cauldron of pitch stood hands that had scrubbed floors the day before, and would do so again the day after, if they survived. It often began with a whisper news carried by a passing merchant or whispered through the chapel from a monk. A neighboring lord had taken offense. Raiders had been spotted on the border. The baron's levy had been called. Whatever the cause, the castle's mood shifted swiftly. Gone was the leisurely rhythm of chores and cleaning. In its place came urgency, fear, and a terrible kind of discipline. The steward's voice grew louder. The cook's orders sharper. The very air seemed to stiffen. The first task for the servants was preparation. The castle gates were checked and braced. Loose stones along the parapets were gathered and piled. Barrels of salted meat were dragged from storerooms and inventoried. Water jugs were filled and sealed. In the kitchen, cauldrons were scrubbed and made ready to feed twice as many mouths with half as much food. Lynette, once a pastry cook's helper, was reassigned to help render animal fat for torches. Her hands became slick with lard, and her hair smelled of smoke and grease for days. She did not complain. No one did. Young boys were sent to assist the blacksmiths. They carried coal and bellows, fetched horseshoes, and sharpened tools. Alice was tasked with tending the armory stairs, making sure there were clean cloths and oil for weapons, sweeping away dust and straw, and keeping track of which knight took what. She learned quickly that a missing dagger or damaged helm could result in more than shouting. One boy was locked in a storage cell overnight after a crossbow string snapped during inspection. When he emerged, he spoke little, and his eyes avoided contact. As the threat grew closer, the castle's routines bent around it. Meals were smaller, fires burned longer. There was less sleep. The servants were expected to double their efforts with no added comfort. Guards now stood at the kitchen door, tracking comings and goings. No one was allowed to leave the grounds. Visitors were turned away. Even the chapel seemed tenser, the priest rushing his prayers as if the words might fail to protect the stone around him. Then came the true preparations for siege. Cauldrons were raised to the battlements, not for soup, but for boiling water, oil, or pitch to be poured on eaters. Barrels were placed near arrow loops to resupply bowmen. Women who normally sewed tunics were now cutting linen into bandages. The healer, usually tucked away in the garden, was summoned to sort herbs and grind roots. Garlic, yarrow, and comfrey were laid out on rough cloth, their smells sharp and bitter. The castle was a hive of motion, but beneath it all ran a cold thread of fear. What if the gates were breached? What if the food ran out? What if the men failed? The servants did not speak of it, but the questions hovered in every glance. Some prayed longer at night. Others left offerings, a flower, a coin, a twist of bread on the chapel sill. Alice found herself watching the sky more often, measuring the clouds for signs of omen or change. And then, one day, the horns blew. Not for a feast or a hunt, but a warning. Riders had been spotted. The gates were closed. The portcullis lowered, the drawbridge raised. From the towers, smoke plumes could be seen in the distance. The enemy was near. The castle transformed again. The great hall became a mustering ground, benches pushed aside, weapons stacked in corners. Nobles shouted over each other, barking orders, reviewing defenses. Servants flitted through the chaos, hauling buckets, handing out bread, keeping the fires alive. Some were sent to guard the livestock. Others moved valuables into the cellars. The youngest were tucked away, told to remain silent and wait. Alice was stationed near the chapel steps. Her job was to carry messages between the kitchen and the battlement's orders for food, cloth, anything that might be needed. She ran up and down the winding stairs 12 times in a day, breath burning in her lungs, legs trembling by nightfall. She saw blood once on the edge of a knight's sleeve, still warm, dripping to the stones. She did not ask what had happened. She only stepped over it and kept going. By the second day, the enemy had surrounded the hill. They did not yet attack, but their presence was a smothering weight. The castle's food was rationed, 1 bowl of stew per person. Bread halved, water poured with care. The servants ate last, and some went without. Still, they worked. They reinforced the walls with barrels and sacks. They turned empty rooms into infirmaries. They boiled linen and bent iron nails into makeshift spikes. And when night fell, they stood watch beside torches, eyes wide, ears straining for the sound of breaking stone. It was not noble duty that kept them moving. It was the knowledge that if the castle fell, they would fall first. No rescue would come for a kitchen maid. No ransom would be paid for a spit boy. The castle's safety was their own, and so they held it with every ounce of effort they had. Sleep came in moments, a head resting against a wall. A girl slumped near the ashes. A boy dozing on his feet beside the door. No blankets, no pillows, just exhaustion. And fear. And waiting. On the 3rd day, the first arrow came silent and sudden, buried deep in the wood of the gate like a clawed finger. Then another, and another. The assault began not with a roar, but with a hiss. Arrows fell like rain, thudding against stone, snapping against beams. She hadn't spoken all morning. The cook's voice rang out with urgency. No waste, no fire too high, no second servings. Servants crouched beside dwindling fires, their eyes heavy but open. They were too afraid to sleep deeply, unsure what noise might mean the end. The wounded lay across the great hall. Blankets, straw, spilled broth. One moaned in sleep. Another sobbed softly into a linen wrap. A girl no older than 13, her hair tangled, wiped sweat from a man's forehead, and whispered a song her mother once sang to her. It didn't matter that he didn't hear it. She needed the sound, the blisters on her palms. She had not slept more than a few hours in a week, but she was alive. The castle was still standing. She turned and stepped back inside. Of strategy. Of strength. But within the stone walls, the servants would remember the weight of each breath, the scrape of a pot, the crack of a stone, the warmth of a hand steadying another as the tower shook. These were not feats sung in songs, but they mattered. They held the castle upright. In the far chamber of the keep, the steward kept a tight log of rations, bodies removed, walls repaired, barrels restocked. The servants lay down, wrapped in blankets stiff with soot and sweat. Alice closed her eyes and saw not dreams, but the kitchen hearth, flickering and alive. War had passed. Peace rough, thin and fragile had returned, and for now, that was enough. Lynette scrubbed the floor beside the armory until her hands bled. She bandaged them with strips torn from her own apron. No one offered thanks. That was not expected. They had done their duty an invisible army, holding the castle not with swords, but with rope, cloth, fire, and faith. The line between day and night blurred. Torches burned through the dawn. The walls shook with impact and then settled again. Hope flickered, faint and fragile. A nod from a wounded guard to a stable boy. A quiet meal shared in the dark. They had been afraid together. They had worked without sleep. They had stood in the shadows of war and kept a light burning. Some said reinforcements were coming. Others didn't believe it. One boy swore he saw fall from the sky and took it as a sign. Lynette rolled her eyes, but later crossed herself quietly when no one was looking. A loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, a cup of ale watered down. The Lord's family received more, of course. The rest made do with thin stew and boiled oats. Outside the kitchen, servants lined up with pails to carry meals to the fighters. The youngest were kept below stairs. Boiling oil was poured from the battlements, prepared by servants who had stirred it for hours, muscles aching from the heat. Alice was sent to the inner wall to fetch clean cloth for a wounded guard. She saw the blood spill across the stone, slick and dark, and did not flinch. She was learning to look, then act. An older boy named Giles was handed a jug of vinegar-soaked rags for tending wounds. He nodded, face pale, and disappeared into the great hall without a word. The servants ducked and scattered, pulling crates over their heads, diving beneath carts, rushing to shutter open windows. On the 7th day, the horns blew again. A rider arrived. The enemy had withdrawn. The castle did not celebrate. Not yet. There was too much silence. Too many dead. Too many tasks left to do. The servants were given orders before the gates reopened. Clean the great hall. Burn the rushes. Wash the linens. Scour the blood from the stone. The guards on the parapets shouted, returning fire with practiced urgency. Inside, the castle came alive with motion, every person moving at double speed, every action weighted with consequence. Alice ran messages between the upper and lower halls. Her fingers clenched around slipped parchment, her legs aching as she climbed stair after stair. She paused only once beside the chapel window, where the sounds of war seemed muffled by the thick glass. She looked out and saw the enemy in the trees, banners like blood in the breeze. The scent of sap and soot mingled with the smell of sweat, hot metal, and boiled onions. The servants moved through it all, like ghosts. They patched leaking buckets. They tied claws around cracked beams. They braced windows and hauled kindling. When a stone from a catapult struck the outer wall, the castle shuddered. Plaster fell from ceilings. A torch collapsed from its sconce, and still they worked. Then a horn sounded, and she turned back, feet slapping against the flagstones, heart pounding. In the kitchen, Lynette stirred 2 massive pots of barley and root vegetable soup, scraping every last bit of lard from the barrels to thicken the broth. Smoke crept into the castle from burning brush outside the walls. At night, the castle did not sleep. Guards marched the battlements. Archers kept watch from arrow slits. On the 4th day, a breach was attempted. The enemy surged at the gate with ladders and battering rams. Arrows flew. Stones were thrown. After the attack was repelled, the castle grew quieter, but not calmer. The servants rotated in shifts, now 3 hours of work, 1 hour of rest, then back again. And then suddenly as it began, the siege lifted. Alice stood outside the kitchen and watched the horizon. Smoke still rose in the distance. She felt the ache in her calves. To clean up was another battle. And yet, something lingered between them, something unspoken. A look exchanged between 2 kitchen girls. The nobles would write a victory. That night, for the first time in days, the great hall was quiet. Chapter 6. The Squire Who Served 2 Masters. The drowsy historian returns now to a quieter form of servitude, one that walked between duty and danger, silence and suspicion, honor and heartbreak. While many servants in the castle lived lives of obscurity, bent beneath kitchen rafters or hunched by hearths, there were others whose roles brought them closer to power, close enough to hear secrets not meant for them, to see cruelty with no room to protest, to feel the weight of loyalty split in two. Tonight, we walk beside a boy named Thomlin, once a farmer's son, then a stable hand, and finally a squire in a castle perched on the edge of civil war. Thomlin was 15 when he was chosen. He had quick hands, a sturdy back, and the good luck of being born to a tenant family favored by the local reeve. His first weeks were spent fetching saddles, rubbing down horses, and being kicked more than once by a skittish mar. But he learned quickly, and soon the master of arms took notice. His promotion to squire came not with ceremony, but with a curt order. You'll serve Sir Roderick. Keep his armor clean. Mind his weapons. Hold your tongue. Thomlin bowed, and so began a life at the edge of the noble world, never quite part of it, never truly separate. Serving a knight was no easy duty. Sir Roderick was fierce and proud, known for his skill in the lists and his temper in the hall. Thalman rose before dawn to polish his armor with vinegar and sand, to brush dirt from his surcoat, to lay out his sword and buckler in perfect alignment. Any mistake, any dull edge, any smudge was met with a cuff to the head or a boot nudging his ribs. Roderick demanded readiness. And yet, there were moments rare and surprising when the knight would nod silently or let Thomlin ride beside him at the edge of the forest, saying nothing but sharing the road. But the castle itself was shifting. Whispers floated like dust motes through the corridors. There was tension between the lord and his cousin, both laying claim to nearby lands, after the death of an heirless baron. Messengers came and went with red seals and hushed orders. Guards doubled at night. The steward walked with a worried crease in his brow. And Thomlin, always just outside the circle, began to hear things. In the armory, while oiling a breastplate, on the stairs, passing the council chamber, at the well, as the washerwomen gossiped between loads. It was during this time that Thomlin's life changed again. He was called not by Sir Roderick, but by Lady Isolde, wife of Lord Everard's cousin, and one of the most cunning women in the castle. She spoke softly and smiled too easily. "Your knight is loyal," she said, "but you see much." Thalman didn't understand then, but soon he did. She began asking small favors. "Deliver this letter. Fetch that scroll. Say nothing to anyone." At first he obeyed out of fear, later out of curiosity. Then, slowly, something more dangerous, ambition. Lady Isolde had plans. So did Sir Roderick. And Thomlin, the servant who had once cleaned stalls, now stood between two forces far beyond his control. Roderick spoke of honor, of defending the rightful claim, of standing by the lord who had given him his title. Isolde, with her knowing eyes, whispered of betrayal, of the old bloodlines, of lands stolen and loyalty sold. Thomlin held both truths in his hands like hot coals. Whichever he dropped would burn him. And yet he did not leave. Where could he go? The castle was all he knew. The kitchens, the stables, the dusty corridors, the smell of boiled leather and beeswax. He dreamed of escape, sometimes, a cottage near a river, a quiet life. But dreams did not feed the hungry. And so he stayed and served and watched the lines being drawn. One night, the castle held a feast. Wine flowed, music swelled, and the nobles laughed too loudly. Thomlin stood behind Sir Roderick's chair, refilling his goblet, brushing crumbs from his sleeves. Across the hall, Lady Isolde nodded once. Thomlin slipped away and found the parchment hidden behind the chapel altar. He returned to his post before anyone noticed. That night he did not sleep. He listened to the wind battering the shutters and wondered what would come next. In the weeks that followed, small things changed. The guard rotations shifted. Certain rooms were locked. The steward's list of supplies grew shorter. Roderick stopped training in the yard and began sharpening his blades in silence. Thomlin began sleeping in his clothes. He hid a dagger beneath his straw mattress. He no longer trusted the kitchen boys or the old woman who swept the stairwell. Every glance felt like a question. Every silence, a warning. And yet, his duties continued. He helped Roderick dress for inspection. He cleaned blood from the knight's gauntlet after a hunting accident. He stood in the rain beside the stable while Roderick argued with the marshal about patrol routes. He combed his master's horse with stiff brushes until his arms ached. All the while he waited. He did not know for what, only that it was coming. One morning, the chapel bell rang at the wrong hour. The castle froze. A messenger arrived with a torn cloak and news of a skirmish in the north fields. Men rode out. Others readied the gate. Thomlin followed Sir Roderick to the armory. His hands moved with practiced precision buckling greaves, lacing gauntlets, securing the helm. Roderick looked at him once, eyes hard. "If I fall, burn the letters in my chamber. All of them. Do not fail me." Thomlin nodded. His heart was pounding. The courtyard echoed with hooves and orders, flags unfurled. Thomlin stood at the gate, watching the riders disappear into the mist. When they were gone, he turned and walked not to Roderick's chamber, but to the northern tower, where Lady Isolde waited. She was dressed in gray, her hair veiled, her face pale. "Well?" she asked. Thomlin did not answer. The tower chamber was quiet, too quiet for a castle under threat. The only sound was the wind outside, scratching at the narrow window slit like an impatient hand. They sat beneath the flagstone in Sir Roderick's chamber, dry and folded, bound with a single green ribbon. "You think you can stay in the middle forever, Thomlin?" Her voice was low and tired. "No one walks the rope without falling." He hadn't delivered them to Iseult either. He didn't stop until he reached the stables, where the familiar scent of hay and horse sweat grounded him. She spoke of power not as duty, but as opportunity. Thomlin was the thread that tied the ends together, fraying fast. One sealed with wax, two tied with twine. He didn't open them. He had learned early that servants who read what wasn't theirs often vanished. Instead, he wrapped them again and left the room. He made his way to the old bell tower, the one rarely used except on high holy days. No one would be there. Roderick called for Thomlin and grunted when he arrived. "You stayed. Good." That was all he said. But he handed Thomlin a small pouch of coin. But one morning, as Thomlin passed her chamber, he found a folded scrap tucked into his belt. It contained no words, just a pressed sprig of rosemary, symbol of remembrance. "You'll need a new cloak before winter." It was more than payment. It was trust reshaped but not broken. But he would never forget the season he served two masters. The choices made not with sword or scroll, but in the silent corners between orders, in the places where servants live, not seen, not heard, but vital, the soul of the castle. If he gave the letters to Iseult, he betrayed Roderick. If he destroyed them, he lost her trust. If he did nothing, both sides would turn against him. Lord Everard had summoned every able-bodied man to the courtyard. Swords were being sharpened, horses saddled. No blood was spilled that day, but the threat lingered in the air like smoke. An agreement was forged temporary, uneasy. Roderick was absent, still recovering. Thomlin waited outside the chapel door, hearing only fragments, land ties, border rights. He didn't care. Not anymore. Thomlin kept his head down, moving through the crowd like mist. He saw Iseult across the yard. Their eyes met. She said nothing, but the look she gave him was not one of betrayal. It was recognition. Perhaps she had known all along what he would choose. No choice was safe. And still, dawn came. She had drawn Thomlin, and not with promises, but with questions that made him imagine a world where he was more than a shadow, more than a servant, where he could write his own name on a scroll one day and not just deliver someone else's. The flames licked upward fast, curling the paper, blackening names he hadn't dared read. He held them until he couldn't, then dropped the remains into the ashes. It was done. Not for Roderick. Not for Iseult. For himself. In the upper hall, guards whispered of a failed ambush and missing riders. A single man had returned, bloodied, hoarse, and trembling. Sir Roderick had survived, but had been injured. A broken arm, they said. Maybe worse. The healer was sent in. The news spread like spilled wine. In the corner of the servant dormitory, Thomlin lay awake, eyes wide in the dark. The mare he favored, a chestnut with a white blaze, stamped softly in her stall. He stroked her nose. His hand shook. The night lay still, his arms splinted and wrapped in linen, his face drawn. The fire was low. Thomlin sat beside it and thought about the first time he'd been struck by Roderick for forgetting to oil a hinge. And then the time the night had given him half a roasted bird on the road without a word. He thought of how Roderick had said nothing when Thomlin cried after his father's death, only placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, then walked away. The night was cruel, but not cold, loyal to a fault, bound to the lord who had raised him, a man of the old rules. His loyalty had become a fragile line pulled taut between two masters, one who ruled with fire and iron, the other with secrets and smoke. Each day it grew harder to breathe. Thomlin stood at the threshold, just clinging to his boots, his shoulders damp from mist. He didn't step further in. Lady Iseult remained motionless near the fire, her hands folded, her gaze fixed on the flames. She didn't ask again. She didn't have to. Thomlin's silence had told her everything. He was wavering. He hadn't burned the letters. Not yet. She finally turned. He didn't reply. Instead, he bowed slightly, turned, and descended the winding staircase. That night, he couldn't sleep. He rose before dawn and crept to Roderick's chamber. Lady Iseld, by contrast, was the future, intelligent, political. She saw the shifting tides of land, lineage and influence. But now everything was unraveling. The cousins were nearly at war. The castle would split, and Thomlin. He finally rose, crossed the room, and lifted the loose stone in the floor. The letters were still there. 3 of them. In the shadow of the great bell, he knelt, struck flint, and lit the edge of the parchment. When he returned to the hall, the castle was in motion. That afternoon, the cousins finally met within the chapel, under the watch of armed men. In the days that followed, life resumed its shape. The kitchen roasted meat again. The guards played dice. The steward scolded a chambermaid for spilling ink. As for Isolde, she stopped asking favors. She no longer summoned him with notes. Years later, Thomlin would serve as squire to another knight and then eventually hold his own command. Chapter 7. The Tower's Secrets Beneath the Floorboards. The drowsy historian invites you now to the oldest part of the castle, its towers. These stone giants loom above the walls and courtyards, filled with spiraling stairs, thick air, and echoes of centuries past. But not all stories about towers are about sentries or noble prisoners. Some are buried far deeper, scratched into forgotten wood, hidden beneath loose boards, and carried in the whispered memories of servants who passed through these cold, winding chambers with quiet eyes and heavy hearts. Beneath the floor of the old prayer chamber, a small octagonal room near the top, someone had carved names into the wood, not once, not in the same hand. Over decades, maybe centuries. Not prayer, not in the formal sense, but reflection. Sometimes Alice would slip away during her rare breaks, just to sit near the names, to breathe where others had breathed. She wondered about them. Who was Isabel? Did she grow old, or did she vanish like so many others? What did the tree mean? Why the stars? What did they fear? What did they hope? Dozens of names, scratched with nails, blades, pieces of charcoal. Some were complete. Isabel, age 11, kitchen maid. Rain lashed the towers. The wood was soft with age, and the steward eventually ordered the prayer room sealed until repairs could be made. But the servants already knew what to do. They had memorized the names. They began carving them elsewhere in the underside of benches, in the barn's beams, on the inside of pantry doors. Not all and not in full, just enough to keep the chain unbroken. Wind howled through the slits. The castle shook, doors slamming, shutters clapping, but listen closely. Perhaps you'd hear the creak of a board, the echo of a name, and somewhere in that forgotten air, the pulse of every hand that passed through, carrying secrets in their bones. Alice was ordered to help secure the upper floors, and she volunteered for the northern tower. As she climbed the spiral stairs, torch in hand, she heard it again, that faint hum. Not words, just sound. She stood still for a long moment, heart thudding. But there was no one there, only the wind. And yet she smiled. It felt like a greeting. Others were initials, barely legible. There were dates, 2 old ones, long before their current lord had taken the castle. There were symbols, simple crosses. They walked the halls blind to the world beneath their feet. To them, servants were background noise necessary, disposable. But those who cleaned their floors, scrubbed their linens, and polished their boots were keeping history in their own way. Not with ink and scrolls, but with the scratch of a blade on wood. The hush of breath in a cold room, the quiet courage to say, I was here. Stars, circles. One even showed a rough drawing of a tree with its roots curling downward. Tonight, we follow those whispers down dim hallways and creaking steps to a place where secrets were not only heard but left behind. A boy named Aldwin had dropped a candle holder, which rolled under the worn prayer bench. When he reached for it, he noticed a board slightly raised. He pried it up and found the names beneath. He told no one at first, only Alice, who he trusted. They went back together the next day, during a rare free hour, and sat cross-legged beside the floor. They traced the letters with their fingers. Some were faded, others deep. The floorboards were scarred with grief, defiance, remembrance. These were the voices of servants who had come and gone, forgotten by history, but not by each other. The northern tower had always been the coldest. It caught the wind off the moors and never warmed, no matter how fiercely the fires below blazed. Small, careful, near the edge where space remained. She did not know why, only that it felt important. To be seen, to be counted. To leave something behind that could not be erased with a mop or a reprimand. Aldwin did the same, his hand shaking slightly as he carved each line with the edge of a broken fork. Servants often dreaded being assigned to it, especially in the winter months. A silent pact passed from hand to hand, broom to broom. The servants never spoke of it aloud, but they guarded it like treasure. When a new girl arrived, barefoot, wide-eyed, trembling with nerves, it was Alice who gently led her upstairs and showed her the floor. She didn't explain it. She didn't need to. The girl nodded, and the next time the board was checked, another name had joined the list. It housed little of interest to nobles, an old storage room, a crumbling armory, a narrow corridor once meant for archers but long since abandoned. Yet despite its disuse, it required regular cleaning. Cobwebs gathered quickly, and the wind funneled dust and leaves through the arrow slits. A rotation of younger servants, those low enough in the hierarchy to have no right to protest, were sent there with rags and torches once every fortnight. Alice had been up there a dozen times, always with someone else, always in silence. There was a hush in the tower that made even footsteps sound like intrusions. Once, while sweeping, she had heard what she thought was a voice, a low hum, like someone singing under their breath. But when she turned, the corridor was empty. She never spoke of it. Other servants had their own stories. Lynette claimed she'd seen a candle still burning in the window after the tower had been locked. Giles said a cat refused to enter the stairwell, hissing and bolting when brought near. But in a castle built on old bones and long memory, these stories were not unusual. Every shadow had a name, every creak, a tale. Still, the northern tower held one mystery that even the stewards couldn't explain. It had been discovered by accident. Alice added her name that day. They weren't the first, and they wouldn't be the last. In the weeks that followed, more names appeared. Quietly, slowly, always in secret. The floorboard was lifted, scratched, replaced. It became a place of solace. Once, in late autumn, a storm rolled in. In the days that followed, the floor began to wear thin. The castle's noble family knew nothing. Tonight, if you were to climb that northern tower past the dust and drafts, you'd find a locked door and silence. After the prayer chamber was locked, the servants spoke of it less. But the memory lingered like perfume on a wool cloak, faint, warm, and never quite gone. It had become more than a hiding place for names. It had become a sanctuary. Not for prayer, but for presence. But she found herself tracing them in her mind while she stirred porridge or beat dust from a rug. The lines came back without trying them. T, 1353, Aliner, age 10, Thomas with the crook cross. Even the odd ones stuck. 3 stars stacked beside a name long scratched away. The curled loop of a tiny snail drawn in the corner. These weren't just idle doodles. They were messages sent forward in time, anchors in a sea of forgetting. Lynette read them aloud, her voice soft. Edric, Alisone, Meg, 2 stars, a crescent moon. He wasn't unkind, just curious, but curiosity had consequences in the castle. Alice took no chances. That night, she and Lynette buried the copy behind the old pigsty beneath the gardener's shed, wrapping it in oilskin and straw. Even the elderly washerwoman, mute since her husband, S. death scratched a letter J into the handle of her wringer with a shard of flint. It spread like ivy, quiet, slow, unstoppable. Memory ticking route, just in case. They made a second, hidden under a loose hearthstone in the pantry. It became a place for storage, nothing more. The stories were swept away like dust. At least that's what the nobles believed. Lynette married a baker's boy and left the castle. Giles moved to another estate and sent no word, but the record remained. Hidden, tended, passed from girl to girl like a secret recipe. The floor was gone. The voices were not. But below, in the warmth of the pantry, In the hidden lines of a ledger, in the pattern of stitches along a servant's shawl, the names lived on. The masons came with chisels and saws. The steward announced the upper chamber would be repurposed. No one objected. No one ever did. The door was opened for the first time in seasons, and workers carried in tools and oil lamps. But somewhere beneath the work and the silence and the dust, the names whispered still. A hidden lineage of those who had labored in shadow. A record not made by lords or monks, but by the hands of those who were never meant to be remembered. And yet somehow were. Allie stood in the kitchen that morning, slicing leeks, her hands steady, her heart heavy. And a third sealed inside a grain barrel never opened, except in times of famine. It felt like a roll call for ghosts. Each name, a bell rung in reverse, bringing memory up from the depths instead of letting it drift away. Each name copied was a tiny rebellion against a world that erased the poor with such ease. But more than that, it was comfort, a tether. When Allie stood beside the cook's fire or passed beneath banners she had no claim to, she touched her apron's hem and remembered, I am part of this place. I am written somewhere. I do not vanish. In a world that measured their worth by obedience, silence, and survival, the hidden floor had whispered back, telling them they mattered, that they had names, that they had weight. Without ceremony, Allie's leaned close and whispered, we need to remember them. That was all she said, and it was enough. Lynette set down her cloth, eyes narrowing with thought. By the next dusk, a plan had begun. Allie's carried that weight with her each day. She did not speak of the names now etched into her memory. They had no say in the decisions of lords and masons. But they could preserve what lay within. Over the next week, in quiet corners, under the guise of routine cleaning or errands, they began copying the names. On scraps of hide, on cloth, even on the backs of old, discarded ledgers. Giles helped. He had a neat hand and once apprenticed under a clerk before his father died. Allie's dictated names while he etched them with charcoal and sharpened quill. Some took hours to decipher. Others had already faded to nothing. Still, they captured what they could. One morning, while sweeping the stairwell beside the northern tower, Allie's overheard two visiting stewards complaining about the tower's decay. The floor's gone soft, one said. The beams won't last another season. The other nodded, muttering something about tearing it down entirely. Repurposing the stones for a new storeroom or even a granary. The words struck Allie's like a thrown pan. She held her broom still for a long moment before quietly stepping away. Later that evening, she returned to the dormitory and found Lynette brushing crumbs from her shift. The servants could not protect the room itself. The record grew. By candlelight in the back of the kitchen, they spread the scraps across the table. But danger loomed. One day, a chamber boy named Willem saw Giles copying names into a sack of wax parchment and asked too many questions. The act of remembering had become an act of defiance. Others caught on. The laundresses added names into seams of towels. The stable hands carved initials beneath the loft beams. Months passed. The northern tower stood, creaking but whole. Then, late one summer, scaffolding was raised. But the copies were safe. The floor was stripped, the names lost, the wood burned with the debris. The tower was cleaned, braced, sealed. Allie's grew older. She trained new maids. Her hands became stiff. Her back ached more often. And so the castle breathed on fires lit, rushes swept, goblets polished. Chapter 8, Cloaks, Chains, and the laundry yard, the drowsy historian, brings you now to a different kind of battlefield, not one of blades and banners, but of boiling water, stiff fingers, and endless scrubbing. The laundry yard of a medieval castle was not a place of beauty. The stone-walled workspace, open to the sky but shielded by a slanted timber roof, echoed with splashes, grunts, and the occasional hiss of boiling pots. At its heart stood 3 large tubs, shallow vats for soaking, rinsing, and dyeing. A narrow drain chiseled into the stone allowed dirty water to trickle down toward the moat or runoff ditch. There they were agitated with paddles or trodden underfoot, a dance that left legs bruised and knees swollen. After soaking, the garments were transferred to the rinse vat, wrung by hand until water poured from sleeves and hems like floodwater from gutters. Then, finally beside the tub sat heavy iron kettles, permanently blackened from fire, in which water was heated day and night. Ash bins stood nearby, feeding lye into the mix and abrasive soap made by steeping wood ash in water. Strong, effective, and brutal on skin. It was a place of steam, lye, and the relentless rhythm of labor that left skin raw and backs bent before their time. Behind every noble's velvet cloak, every priest's linen vestment, every lord's polished undergarment, there stood the invisible work of the laundresses, women and girls who scrubbed and rinsed and wrung in silence, their strength unrecorded, their pain unseen. Tucked behind the stables or near the outer wall, the laundry yard was often far from the main keep. Lynette had been transferred to the laundry yard during a time of staff reshuffling. Her arms, once accustomed to kneading bread and folding linens, now strained beneath the weight of wet wool and sodden sheets. The nobility's garments were laundered with care and better water drawn earlier from the well, before the dust and backwash set in. The priest's robes came next, their whites demanding special attention. Then the squires, the senior servants, and lastly the scullery hands, stable boys, and chambermaids. Their clothes were often stiff with grease and dung, washed only as time permitted. Rags used for cleaning were rarely laundered at all, simply beaten on stones and left to dry in the sun. Her first day left her bleeding beneath her fingernails, but there was no choice. If you can't scrub, you don't stay, the head laundress told her flatly, handing over a wooden paddle. Lynette bit her lip and scrubbed. Laundry was sorted by rank. The process was unforgiving. Soiled clothes were first soaked in cold water to loosen stains, then transferred to a lye bath, an eye-watering mixture that stung cuts and chapped skin within seconds. The laundry yard had no walls to keep out the seasons. When it rained, the troughs overflowed, soaking the hems of their shifts and pooling around their ankles. When it froze, the soap went stiff and the rinse water bit like ice against their wrists. Summer brought gnats and the sour smell of rotting cloth, but winter was the worst. Hands cracked open from frost, wet linens that took days to dry, and the bitter wind that turned every load of laundry into a battle between numbness and duty. And still, the laundresses came because there were always more garments, always more stains, always someone else's dirt to make clean. There were no tools of convenience, no pulleys or presses to ease the work. It was done with shoulders and hands, with legs braced against barrels, with backs bent for hours over steaming water. The skin on Lynette's palms became leathery from the lye, her nails rimmed in permanent gray. Sometimes, when she bathed on feast days, the water stung so sharply she had to bite her sleeve to keep from crying out. But she never stopped. No one did. They had learned that rest was rare, and complaints even rarer. Still, the laundry yard was not always bleak. In those rare hours between loads, after the linens had been laid on the hedges or hung along the lines, the women sat beneath the eaves and let their hands go still. They combed one another's hair with fingers, picked lice from scalps with wooden combs, shared bits of honey bread brought from the kitchens. There was gossip, 2 endless streams of it, always whispered with eyes darting to the corners in case a page or a steward lurked nearby. Who was meeting behind the stables? Which lord's breeches came back smelling of perfume? Which maid hadn't bled this month? The laundry told its own stories, ones woven not from rumor, but from fact. A blood stain, a torn hem, a crusted cuff. Lynette learned to read garments like pages in a book. There were moments of mischief. Once, during a spring rain, Lynette and another girl, Maud, raced barefoot across the yard, laughing as they slipped in the mud, skirts hiked, hair wild. Marion scolded them with a half-smile she didn't quite hide. "You'll break your necks and I'll have to wash your shrouds." But for a few heartbeats, the laundry yard was their own. A place not of burden, but of breath. Then came the day of the cloak. A velvet cloak, deep blue and lined with silver thread, delivered to them in a wax bundle with strict instructions. It belonged to Lady Avira, the visiting niece of a powerful noble. Lynette had never seen such a garment up close. The fabric shimmered like water. The lining was so soft it made her woolen shift feel like burlap. The stain, just a splash of wine near the hem, seemed almost an insult to such beauty. Still, it had to be cleaned. She and Maud worked carefully. They boiled water but let it cool slightly. They steeped rosemary and lavender into the rinse. They dabbed the stain with a clean cloth, turning it slowly beneath the morning light. When it was finally clean, they laid it over a drying rack beneath the thatch, protected from the breeze. For an hour, they watched it, not daring to look away. But then the wind changed. A gust rushed through the yard. The cloak lifted like a sail and fell directly into the muddy puddle at the edge of the trough. Maud screamed first. Lynette moved faster. She pulled the cloak free, already soaking, the hem smeared with brown water and crushed leaves. Panic bloomed in her chest. A ruined noble's cloak was no small matter. She could lose her position. Worse, be whipped, dismissed, or worse still, accused of sabotage. She stood trembling, holding the ruined fabric in her hands, unable to speak. Marion arrived moments later. She took one look, exhaled deeply, then said only, "Inside. Now." They spent the entire afternoon trying to save it. Boiled more water, added vinegar, laid it flat on hot stones to draw out the damp. By sunset, it was clean again, mostly. The silver threads had dulled. The hem was heavier from the soaking. But it looked whole, presentable. Marion tucked it back into the wax bundle and sent it on with a younger girl. No word given of the mishap. Lady Avira never noticed, but Lynette did not forget. For weeks afterward, her hands trembled when handling anything finer than wool. Marion, in her way, never spoke of the incident again. But 2 days later, she gave Lynette the next noble garment to clean another test. Trust, like linen, once stained, could be scrubbed, but it rarely came back pure. It had to be earned again. The laundry yard taught its lessons in water and silence. There was no room for vanity, no time for rest. But within its steaming borders, the laundresses carved out meaning where they could, in the folds of a shirt pressed flat, in the scent of clean wool, in the soft hiss of steam rising from the stones. They were not seen, but they were necessary. Lynette learned this not from being praised, but from being trusted again. With every garment she washed, every hem she saved, every day she did not break under the weight of it all. She built something invisible but real, her place in the castle, not high, not named, but there. And so, as the sun set behind the outer wall, casting long shadows across the racks of drying linens, Lynette stood with cracked hands in quiet pride. Around her, the other women moved like ghosts in the steam, their voices low, their laughter rare but real. The world would forget their names, but not their labor. It clung to every noble's back like a second skin. Chapter 9, Segment 1, The Bellringer's Blisters. The drowsy historian invites you now to the highest corners of the castle, where the wind never stops and the stone steps seem to spiral into the sky. The bell tower, perched above the rest of the keep, was not just a lookout, nor merely a place for iron to toll across the fields. It was also a post of labor, ritual, and pain. Tonight, we follow the servant whose job it was to make the castle ring, to rise before others stirred, to endure wind and weight and cold, and to bear the burden of time itself. This is the life of the bell ringer, and it is far heavier than sound alone can reveal. The castle bell was no small ornament, forged in black iron and mounted high above the courtyard. It weighed more than a war horse and was suspended from beams thick as tree trunks. When struck, its voice could carry for miles across the fields, through the forest, down to the village. It called the noble family to prayer, the guards to arms, the servants to work. It marked the hours of labor, the moment of death, the cry for help in times of fire or siege, but it did not ring itself. It required hands. And for nearly 2 years, those hands belonged to a boy named Derek. Derek was not born into service. He had been sold into it at the age of 12, after a failed harvest left his family starving. His father brought him to the castle gate and handed him over to the steward in exchange for 3 sacks of rye and a skin of oil. He never looked back. Derek had not spoken of it since. He was tall for his age, lean but strong, and had a strange comfort with silence. It was this, combined with his tendency to rise early, that earned him the bell post. No one else wanted it. The tower was high, the rope course, the hours brutal. The bell rang first before dawn, then at terce, again at sext, and finally at vespers. 4 times a day, every day, in sun, wind, and snow. Derek lived in a narrow cell beneath the belfry, barely wider than the cot it held. There was a single window, an arched slate cut into the stone that let in light, but never warmth. Ringing the bell was not as simple as pulling a cord. The rope was thick and stiff, requiring his full weight to move. His palms blistered in his first week, tore open in the second, and finally formed calluses by the third. The pull required timing and rhythm too early, and the bell would stall. Too late, and it would jar sideways in its frame, shaking the beams. Once, during a storm, lightning struck the roof as Derek gripped the rope. The blast knocked him flat, and he woke to find his hair singed and ears ringing, though the bell itself was untouched. Each morning he climbed the final stairs barefoot, the stone slippery with dew. He stood beneath the massive body of the bell, waiting for the moment marked by the sundial in the courtyard below. He couldn't always see it through the fog, but he counted the time by breath and instinct. When the hour arrived, he wrapped the rope around his arm, braced his feet, and threw his weight back. The bell swung once, twice, and then began its arc, slow and sonorous, echoing across the valley. Derek pulled until his arms trembled, then let it slow, rocking in the still air. On feast days, the bell rang more often. On fast days, it rang longer. During funerals, it tolled in solemn rhythm, once for each year of the deceased's life. Derek once rang the bell 93 times for an old knight who had passed quietly in his sleep. His arms ached for 2 days after. On another occasion, the Lord's hunting party had been caught in a blizzard. Derek rang until the search party returned 3 full hours without pause, each pull a prayer wrapped in sweat and snow. Despite his isolation, Derek knew the castle better than most. From the bell tower, he saw everything who came and went. Which servants lingered near which doors, which knights left early and returned late. He saw lovers meet in the gardens and stable hands sneak bread to the dogs. He never spoke of what he saw. That silence became its own kind of power. But the role had its cost. The tower was lonely. Derek often went days without speaking to anyone. Meals were brought up in baskets, left on hooks beside the stairwell. He read, when he could borrow scraps of writing, and whittled small figures from bits of firewood. Sometimes, during long winter nights, he would hum to the bell, imagining it was listening back. It was not companionship, but it was something. His hands became his story, calloused, blackened, the skin around his knuckles permanently hardened. No one shook them unless necessary. Once, a steward told him to wash before appearing in the chapel. Derek did, scrubbing until his skin peeled, but the stains never fully left. They were not dirt. They were part of him. Derek took pride in precision. The bell rang on time, every time, and with the same solemn grace regardless of the weather or his own strength. One spring he grew ill of fever that left him drenched in sweat, barely able to stand. Still, at dawn, the bell rang. Later, the steward found him collapsed beside the rope, breathing shallow. He was given broth and told to rest. But before the next hour came, he was at the rope again, arms trembling, jaw set. It was his duty. He did not know another life. One evening, as the sun set in a ribbon of fire across the trees, Derek stood in the tower's opening and watched the shadows stretch over the fields. The bell hung behind him, still and waiting. He placed his hand on its flank, the iron cool beneath his fingers. Below, the castle moved in its daily rhythm, kitchen smoke rising, boots crossing stone, laughter drifting from the lower hall. None of them looked up. None of them thought of him. But they had moved, lived, worshipped, and mourned to the sound of his labor. And he, in his silence, had shaped their time. He pulled the rope. The sound rolled out like breath, deep, steady, eternal. But for Derek, time had weight. Time had echo. On the rare day when weather or injury delayed the bell even a few minutes, heads would turn in the courtyard. "For your arms," one of them once said, pointing at the corded muscle beneath his rolled sleeve. He saw the banners change when visitors came. He watched the lord's daughter meet the falconer beneath the fig tree on summer evenings. He saw the grave dug at dawn for the steward's mother, even before the household was told she had died. He knew which knights rode out at night and returned muddy and bruised. He knew where the guard at the north wall hid his bottle. He kept it all. Said nothing. But every story passed beneath him like a page turned slowly in the wind. When winter came again, Derek finally asked to be moved from the cell to the lower dormitory. His joints ached too badly from the climb. He kept one hand on the rope, not to pull, but to feel the vibration in his palm. On his last ascent, he left something behind. A mark on the beam. Carved with the tip of a nail, his initials, DH, beneath the date. And every servant who heard it knew not all thrones sit beneath crowns. Some hang from rope, swaying gently in towers no one climbs. A quiet record, like those names beneath the floorboards in the prayer chamber long ago. The steward agreed without question, perhaps because of the bell's decades of flawless timing, or perhaps because no one wanted to anger the tower's ghost. A younger page once asked if he'd ever crushed a man with his grip. His name was Janin, a weaver's son with quick fingers and too many questions. He was found lying on his side, hands folded, breath stilled, the lines of rope wear still etched across his palms like vines. Janin rang the bell that day slow, heavy, one toll for every year of service. He chattered constantly during his first week, asking about the bell's weight, its name, and how high up they were. One evening, Janin came to him with red eyes and said, Derek understood. He handed the boy a small carving, one of the figures he had whittled from firewood. A tiny bell with a rope carved in a perfect spiral around it. Yours now, he said. Janin kept it in a pouch around his neck after that. From then on, he asked fewer questions. Derek answered what he could, though mostly in nods and gestures. Still, he climbed the steps each morning. Still, he pulled the rope. On the day of the great wedding, the lord's son and a princess from the southern coast, he rang the bell 10 times for joy. The sound echoed across the valley, bouncing off trees, drifting down the river. He watched from the high slit window as guests danced in the courtyard and lanterns were lit in the towers. No one looked up, but the sound was his. His work filled the sky. He was not cruel, but he was used to quiet. Janin was not. Derek smiled, just a flicker. Only the bell, he said, and that was the end of it. Derek taught him when to brace the rope with one knee, how to time the bell's swing with breath and shoulder rather than brute force. He showed him how to oil the clapper, how to check for ice on the joints, how to spot a crack before it grew dangerous. Slowly, the boy grew stronger. His chatter lessened. His hands hardened. Derek began to leave him alone during terce, watching from the base of the tower. The bell rang just the same. Why hasn't it rung? They'd ask each other. Voices lowered. And for a brief, silent moment, they remembered him, not his name perhaps, but his place, his importance. It was a strange sort of presence, to be known only when absent. He could feel the rhythm of the day in his shoulders, in his wrists, in the deep tremble of his spine after each toll. He didn't need to hear the stewardess call or see the smoke from the kitchen fires to know it was noon. His body told him. His muscles marked it, his bones remembered. People rarely visited the tower except when something went wrong. When the bell jammed once during a frost and fell still for an entire morning. It was Derek who was blamed before the beams were even inspected. The steward climbed the spiral steps, red-faced, barking threats. But the cause was simple ice had cracked one of the wooden supports, shifting the alignment of the axle. Derek explained this with few words. The steward, not understanding the mechanics but unwilling to admit it, only grunted and descended without apology. The next morning, Derek repaired the frame himself, wrapping the crack with a wet rope that would tighten when dry and steady the bell until a mason could be summoned. No one thanked him, but the bell rang on time that day, and that was all that mattered. Though few spoke to him, Many noticed when his work stopped. Derek's hands became his currency. When he went to the kitchen to fetch bread or broth, the maids gave him extra without asking. The tower saw everything. Derek knew more than most, not because he asked questions, but because he simply existed above the answers. One autumn, a second boy was brought to train under him. Still, the boy learned. And yet, there were things he could not teach, like how to bear the loneliness. Years passed like tolls steady, unrelenting. Derek's body aged faster than his face. His back stiffened. His fingers began to cramp in the cold. In time, Janin took over more of the tolls. Derek supervised, corrected his form, nodded approval. Derek did not stop entirely. On holy days, he still climbed, slower now, and stood beside Janin as the bell swung. One morning, the bell rang at dawn, clear and strong. And Derek did not rise from his cot. The castle below paused. No one said his name aloud. But the silence between each ring was a kind of prayer. Chapter 10, The Servant Who Vanished at Midnight. The drowsy historian brings you now into the hush of night, where firelight flickers low and shadow walks beside every step. The medieval castle at midnight was a place transformed. The laughter from the hall had long faded. The fires banked low, the great doors barred. Most nobles slept beneath fur blankets and velvet canopies, lost in wine-heavy dreams, where dried herbs and salt meats were kept under lock and key. Her job was to take inventory once a week, clean the flagstones. Not because she was cruel, she wasn't, but because she was unbothered, not angry. Nothing extravagant. Her wooden bowl stacked with the others by the hearth. At first, no one said much, none had seen her. The kitchen mistress scowled and muttered about laziness. The chaplain shrugged and said perhaps she'd return to her people in the fens. But the other servants didn't believe it. Something in the way her cot remained perfectly made. The stores were inventoried again, the firewood restocked, the hearth swept, but Katrin's name lived on in strange places. Her stool remained at the back of the washing room, untouched. And on the wall near the lower storeroom, scratched just above the firewood stack, someone found a small mark. A crescent moon, carved in the stone. Beside it, a single word. Gone. A folded shift found in the chapel with lavender sewn into the hem, but no one removed it either. A copper token reappearing beside the fire that hadn't been seen since the night it was lost, when the only sound was the creak of beams and the hiss of cooling stone. Those who had known her briefly, barely sometimes, looked toward the lower stair and wondered, had she run? Had she fallen? Or had the castle itself, old and alive in its own way, claimed her? Once, a pot of barley porridge went missing before morning. No one claimed it. But one maid, walking through the lower corridor in the early light, swore she smelled smoke and something sweet rosemary or cloves. The way her name was still faintly scratched into the underside of the washing stool, it felt final, planned maybe. But by whom? Servants sometimes slipped away in the night, especially in the colder months. But Katrin had left no belongings behind because she'd never had any, no keepsakes, no spare shift, no scraps hidden in the folds of her cot. It was as if she'd always intended to leave. And for those who toil unseen, mysteries are rare things, precious, dangerous, unforgettable, or never existed at all. Still, the scullery had worked past midnight, scrubbing meat from platters, wiping grease from pewter goblets, boiling linens. Katrin had been seen last heading toward the lower stores, carrying a bundle of firewood. She wore no cloak, just a tunic and her thin work shoes. She nodded once to the guard on the stair. Then she vanished, not afraid. Just present. And in a castle where most servants had been hardened by hunger, grief, or beatings, Katrin's stillness felt like something unnatural. Some whispered she was the daughter of a witch. Others claimed she had once belonged to a convent, until something terrible had happened. But no one knew for sure. She didn't speak of the past. She listened instead. Too well, and tend the fire that kept the damp from spoiling the grain. It was not glamorous work, but it was steady, and she performed it without complaint. Her voice, when she used it, was almost too soft to carry. She asked few questions. she did what was asked. But what set her apart more than her silence or speed was how she seemed to know things before they were said. Some claimed she'd fallen down the old well behind the granary. Others whispered of a secret tunnel beneath the storeroom, once used by monks to smuggle relics during the wars. One boy said she had walked straight into the chapel at midnight and disappeared behind the altar. A girl swore she'd seen footprints leading away from the back gate barefoot, headed into the forest, but no one followed them. A chambermaid once jokingly mentioned needing more lavender in a lady's bedchamber, and the next morning a fresh bundle appeared on her pillow. Another time, a boy had dropped a copper token down a drainage slot. No one could find it. Katrin reached into the ash chute without hesitation and pulled it free. But servants? Some of them worked long after the bells fell silent, and some, like the girl whose tale you'll hear tonight, were never seen again. Not in the light of morning. Not even in the whispers of those who had once worked beside her. Her name was Katrin. Or at least that as the name the scullery maids used when they spoke of her, rarely and carefully, for reasons they never explained fully. Katrin had come to the castle just before Michaelmas, brought in with a cartload of other poor girls from the outer fens. Her eyes were the color of dark water, her speech soft and clipped. She didn't laugh much, but she worked hard scrubbing pots, hauling ash, folding linens with crisp, tight corners. The older maids called her quiet as a bat and said she moved like steam on stone there, and then not. She had been assigned to the lower corridor near the storage vaults. The servants didn't trust her, not fully. Then came the night of her disappearance. It was late autumn, and the castle was damp with mist. That evening, there had been a small feast, just the household and a visiting noble. By morning, she had not returned to the dormitory. Her cot was empty, blanket folded. The steward questioned the guards. Rumors grew, as they always do in places with stone walls and too many ears. The truth, if it existed, remained buried. In the weeks that followed, the castle carried on. New servants arrived. The steward eventually struck Katrin's name from the records. No one spoke of her officially after that, but her cot was never reassigned. No one knew who carved it. And so, in the quiet hours when the castle slept, in a place built of cold logic and hard labor, Katrin was a mystery. The castle did not grieve long when servants vanished. It couldn't afford to. The rhythm of life was too steady, too relentless. The oven still needed stoking. The rushes still needed sweeping. The lords and ladies still demanded their comforts, and the steward's list still ticked on like a relentless clock. When Katrin disappeared, her absence was swallowed quickly by the needs of the day. A sliver of bread, a scrap of ribbon, a folded piece of cloth, always small, always quiet. They called her Mistress of the Quiet, said she walked the stone halls, barefoot, leaving no sound, but changing things in tiny ways. Clean spoon where none had been a tucked blanket, a jug filled that had been left empty. One even claimed she had found a polished stone tucked into her shoe one morning, though she'd left it by the door half broken. She fixes what's forgotten, they whispered. But only if you don't ask her to. Below it, newer than before, another word had been scratched, shallow but clear. A superstition, perhaps. Or maybe a kind of apology for having let her vanish unseen. And even then, she moved quickly, looking over her shoulder as though she expected someone to be just behind her watching. Not threatening, just there. But some watched quietly, with the memory of her still coiled in the corners of their minds, like smoke that refuses to lift. And over time, she became less a person and more a question. A reminder that not all who serve are meant to be seen. Some serve once, then vanish. And in their place, something softer remains. In the scent of dried herbs where none had been placed. In the untouched stool beside the hearth. The castle did not forget entirely. It had absorbed her, the way it had absorbed so many others. But where most servants left no mark at all, she had left something delicate and lingering, a thread of quiet, of mystery, of presence just out of reach. The oldest of the laundry women, a bent-backed woman named Gilda, once claimed she saw Katrin in a dream. She had never been down there before and didn't know the stories. She worked quietly, whistling softly, trying to warm her fingers as she moved from hearth to barrel to bin. When she reached the far corner, she noticed a strange shine in the stonework, a sliver of something smooth behind the logs. She reached for it, pulling aside the stacked wood, and there it was. She left, he said firmly. Again and again. She wasn't taken. She wasn't magical. She wasn't anything. But even he began to avoid the lower corridor, choosing a longer path to the cellars, and asking the grooms to check the fire there instead of going himself. Not walking or speaking, just standing at the foot of her cot, hands folded, eyes full of stillness. Others remembered only moments, a soft hand brushing past, a whisper of cloth, a name murmured once and never again. Yet her story remained, passed from maid to boy, from stable hand to scullery girl. It changed as all stories do. Some said she was a noble child hidden in plain sight. Others swore she had never been alive at all, but a spirit in flesh form sent to test the servants' hearts. Jory, one of the young torchbearers, swore he saw a figure slip into the herb cellar during a midnight sweep. Cold spots that lingered even in spring. Whispers that flickered through archways at night. Fireplaces that refused to light unless a specific log was used. The servants lived with these things the way farmers lived with storms, expected, endured, and never questioned too loudly. After Katrin's disappearance, those moods shifted. The corridor near the lower stores grew colder. The hearth there would often sputter out no matter how carefully it was tended. Once, the fire refused to catch for an entire week, until someone laid a sprig of lavender on the coals. It flared at once. He followed, torch raised. But when he reached the archway, there was no one. Only rows of dried thyme, rosemary, and nettle hanging still as bone. Yet on the floor near the wall lay a single bundle of lavender tied with a red string, the kind Katrin had always used, knotted twice at the top. He didn't speak of it to the steward, just picked it up and left it at the chapel steps. She didn't blink. Gilda whispered to a kitchen girl one morning, wringing out a tunic with trembling hands. Just looked at me, like she knew something I didn't, like she was waiting. Others had their own strange moments. The castle was not haunted in the dramatic way of stories. No slamming doors or howling corridors, but it had moods. No one said it aloud, but some servants began leaving small offerings near that corridor. The younger servants, especially those brought in after she was gone, began to tell stories in hushed tones around the straw beds at night. The steward hated such talk. He banned mention of her name in the kitchens and threatened to dismiss anyone caught gossiping. As the years passed, the memory of Katrin blurred into the broader life of the castle. Some who had worked with her forgot her face. One icy winter, long after she had gone, a new maid named Bryony was tasked with sweeping the lower corridor. A carving, faint, half-buried, the crescent moon. Still, Bryony told no one. But she never returned to that corridor again unless ordered, and so Katrin remained, not in body, not in voice. But in the hush between steps, no one ever found a body. No trail was discovered. Chapter 11. Secrets in the Sewers. The drowsy historian invites you now to the underside of the castle, where torchlight dances on damp stone and the air hangs thick with rot and echoes. Beneath every great hall, beneath the grand staircases and banners and tapestries, ran another world dark, narrow, wet, and vital. It was in the tunnels and trenches, the culverts and drains, that some of the castle's dirtiest work took place. Few nobles ever gave it thought, even fewer dared venture down. Trickling water, distant murmurs, sometimes rats, sometimes worse. The smell clung to him like a second skin. Other servants avoided him at mealtimes, not cruelly, just instinctively. He sat at the edge of the table, closest to the door. Sometimes he muttered to himself, naming the pipes as if they were old friends. The castle's entire sanitation depended on the constant movement of waste through dozens of narrow paths. If even one trench clogged, the stench could rise into the lower chambers. If 3 clogged, the Lord might notice. And if 5 did, there'd be sickness fever, boils, worse. These required lowering himself down with a rope, a bucket, and nothing but a wet cloth over his nose. The weight of the air alone was enough to knock some boys senseless. The steward was furious. Daniel was summoned with no explanation, dragged from his bowl of onions, handed a fresh torch, and ordered below. He followed the flow, squatting where the water turned black and fast. He jabbed it with his rake. Something shifted. A buckle glinted. Then something pale floated free, long, and thin, and unmistakably a human arm. The blockage was bad. Not just a clump of rags or a stray bone. It was something large jammed between two stones where 3 tunnels met. But Daniel began to leave small things at the spot, half an apple, a twist of string, once a feather. So he remembers someone new, he said. He scrambled back, half sobbing, slipping on moss, soaking his boots. They blamed it on mischief, on prankery gone wrong. Daniel said nothing. But he stopped humming for a long time after that. He crawled until he found light again, blinking in the dawn-gray air near the outer grate. He leaned in, pressed the torch low. Daniel had learned to breathe shallow, to work fast. Once, he found the bones of a bird buried in the muck. Another time, he pulled up a silver pin engraved with a noble house's crest. He kept it, hidden in a crack in the stones. She dropped it, he'd say to the pin sometimes. Don't know if it was an accident or not. Daniel had seen it once, when he was still small, before he'd been assigned the tunnels. A summer heat wave and a blocked cesspit. The infirmary filled within days. He remembered the smell sweeter than rot, which was always worse, and the way the steward didn't come out of his room for a week. Greta's gurgling again, he'd say, meaning the sluice beneath the larder. Time to scrape her throat. Once, he swore he heard singing high and warbled, far off in a curve of pipe so narrow even he couldn't crawl through. That during the black hours, the brief, unlucky stretch, just before dawn voices could be heard whispering names. That sometimes, when the trench water rose too high and touched the walls, it revealed marking symbols no one dared copy. Daniel shrugged at such tales. But even he tied a bit of cloth to his wrist each morning, a charm sewn with thread from his mother's old apron. For keeping breath in, he said. Water flowed where it would. Stones cracked when they couldn't take the pressure. If you paid attention, nothing surprised you. He liked that. He never went back that way. Not because he was afraid, exactly, but because there are some things even the bravest muck-slicked boy doesn't question twice. When he crawled into the smallest of runoff pipes, when he jammed his rake into a clod of old rushes, bones, and rotting scraps, he didn't complain. He worked with his mouth shut and his eyes narrowed. Sometimes he hummed. He said it kept the bad spirits from following him too far down. But to the castle's lowest servants, the ones whose lives were measured not in hours but in filth, the sewers were a kind of kingdom all their own. Daniel was one such servant. He was perhaps 16, narrow-shouldered, and always damp around the collar. His job was listed on the steward's roster simply as drain boy, though everyone knew what that meant. He spent his days deep in the waste channels, clearing blockages, emptying cesspits, and keeping the water moving so that the castle didn't drown in its own stench. He was paid in dry bread, old turnips, and once a year, a pair of wooden-soled boots. Even those he rarely wore bare feet were better in the sludge, he'd say easier to clean. Daniel entered the tunnels each morning with a torch and a rake. He knew the passages better than most knew the upper halls. There was the old Roman drain beneath the kitchens, still lined with stone, worn smooth by centuries. There was the newer trench built after the fire, which rattled when you walked too hard on the stone above. He'd marked the safe spots with chalk, but the marks didn't always last. Moisture had a way of erasing things. The tunnels were alive with sound. His hands were always brown from grime, his nails dark, no matter how often he scrubbed them with lime. Daniel didn't mind. The sewers were quiet, predictable, and unlike the castle above, down here, no one lied. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was critical. So Daniel took his job seriously. Of course, the other servants told stories. That the tunnels were haunted. The worst jobs were the clean-outs, deep pit drains at the base of the garderobes. Then came the day of the blockage. A main trench had overflowed during a feast, flooding the larder. It was fabric, cloth, soaked and swollen, caught in a jag of stone. Daniel didn't scream. He never had. But he dropped the torch. It hissed in the water, plunging him into blackness. Later, the guards pulled the body. A stable boy, gone 3 weeks. Thought to have run. The sewers were cleaned. The blockage cleared. Life went on. And down in the dark, where no footsteps ever echoed but his own, the tunnels whispered back. Chapter 11. Secrets in the Sewers. The drowsy historian invites you now to the underside of the castle, where torchlight dances on damp stone and the air hangs thick with rot and echoes. Beneath every great hall, beneath the grand staircases and banners and tapestries, ran another world, dark, narrow, wet, and vital. It was in the tunnels and trenches, the culverts and drains, that some of the castle's dirtiest work took place. Few nobles ever gave it thought, even fewer dared venture down. Trickling water, distant murmurs, sometimes rats, sometimes worse. The smell clung to him like a second skin. Other servants avoided him at mealtimes, not cruelly, just instinctively. He sat at the edge of the table, closest to the door. Sometimes he muttered to himself, naming the pipes as if they were old friends. The castle's entire sanitation depended on the constant movement of waste through dozens of narrow paths. If even one trench clogged, the stench could rise into the lower chambers. If 3 clogged, the Lord might notice. And if 5 did, there'd be sickness, fever, boils, worse. These required lowering himself down with a rope, a bucket, and nothing but a wet cloth over his nose. The weight of the air alone was enough to knock some boys senseless. The steward was furious. Daniel was summoned with no explanation, dragged from his bowl of onions, handed a fresh torch, and ordered below. He followed the flow, squatting where the water turned black and fast. He jabbed it with his rake. Something shifted. A buckle glinted. Then something pale floated free, long, and thin, and unmistakably a human arm. The blockage was bad. Not just a clump of rags or a stray bone. It was something large jammed between 2 stones where 3 tunnels met. But Daniel began to leave small things at the spot, half an apple, a twist of string, once a feather. So he remembers someone new, he said. He scrambled back, half sobbing, slipping on moss, soaking his boots. They blamed it on mischief, on prankery gone wrong. Daniel said nothing. But he stopped humming for a long time after that. He crawled until he found light again, blinking in the dawn-gray air near the outer grate. He leaned in, pressed the torch low. Daniel had learned to breathe shallow, to work fast. Once, he found the bones of a bird buried in the muck. Another time, he pulled up a silver pin engraved with a noble house's crest. He kept it, hidden in a crack in the stones. She dropped it, he'd say to the pin sometimes. Don't know if it was an accident or not. Daniel had seen it once, when he was still small, before he'd been assigned the tunnels. A summer heat wave and a blocked cesspit. The infirmary filled within days. He remembered the smell sweeter than rot, which was always worse, and the way the steward didn't come out of his room for a week. Greta's gurgling again, he'd say, meaning the sluice beneath the larder. Time to scrape her throat. Once, he swore he heard singing high and warbled, far off in a curve of pipe so narrow even he couldn't crawl through. That during the black hours, the brief, unlucky stretch just before dawn, voices could be heard whispering names. That sometimes, when the trench water rose too high and touched the walls, it revealed marking symbols no one dared copy. Daniel shrugged at such tailies. But even he tied a bit of cloth to his wrist each morning, a charm sewn with thread from his mother's old apron. For keeping breath in, he said. Water flowed where it would. Stones cracked when they couldn't take the pressure. If you paid attention, nothing surprised you. He liked that. He never went back that way. Not because he was afraid, exactly, but because there are some things even the bravest muck-slick boy doesn't question twice. When he crawled into the smallest of runoff pipes, when he jammed his rake into a clod of old rushes, bones, and rotting scraps, he didn't complain. He worked with his mouth shut and his eyes narrowed. Sometimes he hummed. He said it kept the bad spirits from following him too far down. But to the castle's lowest servants, the ones whose lives were measured not in hours but in filth, the sewers were a kind of kingdom all their own. Daniel was one such servant. He was perhaps 16, narrow-shouldered and always damp around the collar. His job was listed on the steward's roster simply as drain boy, though everyone knew what that meant. He spent his days deep in the waste channels, clearing blockages, emptying cesspits, and keeping the water moving so that the castle didn't drown in its own stench. He was paid in dry bread, old turnips, and once a year, a pair of wooden-soled boots. Even those he rarely wore bare feet were better in the sludge, he'd say easier to clean. Daniel entered the tunnels each morning with a torch and a rake. He knew the passages better than most knew the upper halls. There was the old Roman drain beneath the kitchens, still lined with stone, worn smooth by centuries. There was the newer trench built after the fire, which rattled when you walked too hard on the stone above. He'd marked the safe spots with chalk, but the marks didn't always last. Moisture had a way of erasing things. The tunnels were alive with sound. His hands were always brown from grime, his nails dark, no matter how often he scrubbed them with lime. Daniel didn't mind. The sewers were quiet, predictable, and unlike the castle above, down here, no one lied. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was critical. So Daniel took his job seriously. Of course, the other servants told stories that the tunnels were haunted. The worst jobs were the clean-outs, deep pit drains at the base of the garderobes. Then came the day of the blockage. A main trench had overflowed during a feast, flooding the larder. It was fabric, cloth, soaked and swollen, caught in a jag of stone. Daniel didn't scream. He never had. But he dropped the torch. It hissed in the water, plunging him into blackness. Later, the guards pulled the body. A stable boy, gone 3 weeks. Thought to have run. The sewers were cleaned. The blockage cleared. Life went on. And down in the dark, where no footsteps ever echoed but his own, the tunnels whispered back. Daniel returned to the tunnels the very next morning, before the steward could send for him. No one else wanted the job. The older servants avoided eye contact when they passed him by the well. Even the guards shifted awkwardly, like standing near him might invite misfortune. But he didn't care. The tunnels were his, and the thought of leaving them untended filled him with more dread than returning to the place where he had discovered the boy's body. That first day back, he took a new torch and brought 2 rakes instead of 1. He worked with a quiet urgency, clearing the junctions, checking every wall for cracks. He avoided the corner where the stable boy had been found for as long as he could, but eventually he went back. The water still flowed sluggishly there, and the stone around it seemed darker than usual, as if stained. Daniel crouched and stared into the tunnel's curve. There was nothing to see, but he placed his hand on the edge and whispered, "Still here." He didn't know why he said it. The next few weeks passed without incident. The drains functioned. The air remained foul but breathable. Yet something had shifted. Daniel could feel it in his steps and the way the rats moved around him, in the subtle rhythm of water against stone. It was as though the tunnels had become aware of his presence, not as a worker, but as someone who had uncovered one of their secrets. He started having dreams. Damp, heavy dreams filled with dripping ceilings and voices that echoed without form. He would wake in the dark, heart racing, fingers clenched around the edge of his cot. The dreams left him with phrases he couldn't explain, half-spoken warnings, pieces of old prayers. One phrase stayed with him more than any other. Follow the flow backward. He didn't understand it at first, but it gnawed at him until one evening, after the vesper bell had rung and the castle's candles were nearly burned low, he did just that. He took his torch, descended into the tunnels, and instead of tracing the sewage downstream as he usually did, he followed it in reverse from the lower trenches near the outer wall, up toward the older, deeper chambers beneath the main keep. Few ever went this far. Some of the passages hadn't been cleared in years. The walls were slick with mildew, the air thick and stale. But Daniel pressed on. After nearly an hour of crawling, wading, and squeezing past half-collapsed arches, he found something he'd never seen before. A door. It wasn't large, barely 5 feet tall, made of swollen oak bound in iron bands, but it was a door nonetheless, set into the stone like it had always been there. No handle, just a carved symbol in the center, a spiral, flanked by 2 short vertical lines. It looked ancient, older than the castle itself. He touched it. The wood was cold, drier than it should have been given the moisture around it. He didn't try to open it. Something told him not to. Not yet. Instead, he marked the wall beside it with a bit of crushed chalk and backed away slowly, torch raised high. The shadows behind him seemed deeper, but the door didn't move. It waited, quiet as stone. He returned the next day, and the day after that. Always just to look. The door never changed. But he noticed new things each time scratches at the base. The faint smell of earth rather than waste. The way the water curved away from it instead of toward. He began to believe the door hadn't been meant for drainage at all. That perhaps, long ago, this part of the tunnels had served another purpose. A secret passage. A hidden vault. A burial chamber. No one above spoke of it. When he asked the steward once, carefully, whether any old blueprints of the castle existed, he was met with a grunt. Nothing useful, the man said. Too many renovations. Half the oldest bits are bricked up now. Daniel didn't ask again, but he kept returning. Then, one day the chalk mark he'd made was gone. He stood in the dark, staring at the blank wall, heart hammering. The door was still there, unchanged, but the mark, the one thing that told him this spot was real, not imagined, had vanished. It hadn't washed away. The wall was dry. It hadn't crumbled. There was no powder on the floor. Someone or something had wiped it clean. He left quickly that day, torch crackling at his side, breath loud in the tunnel. He didn't go back for a week. When he finally did, there was a new mark on the door. A single X scratched faintly near the base. And tucked into the corner beside the hinge, nearly hidden in shadow, was a ribbon, red, tied in a double knot. He didn't touch it. He just stared, because he knew that knot. Everyone in the castle had heard stories of Katrin, the girl from the lower stores. The one who vanished. The one who always tied her herbs in red ribbon, double knotted at the top. The sewer tunnels were old. Older than Daniel, older than the steward, maybe older than the castle itself. They held the wastes of kings and the secrets of the forgotten. And now, perhaps a story no one had yet finished telling. Daniel turned back, boots wet, torch low. He would return again. He wasn't afraid. But he understood now there were places in the castle not meant to be scrubbed clean. Some filth was historical. Some silence was sacred. The door would wait. And beneath the stones, the castle remembered. Chapter 12. Banquet scraps and bitter wine. The drowsy historian now takes you into the castle's great hall. Not during the silence of sleep, but at its loudest, liveliest, and most dangerous during a feast. For all the gilded candlesticks, velvet cushions, silver platters, and roaring fires. Few ever speak of the unseen figures darting behind the scenes. The ones with aching feet, raw fingers, soot-streaked foreheads, and no right to sit, to taste, or to rest. To be a servant during a medieval banquet was to witness splendor from the shadows, to stand within reach of power and yet belong to none of it. The banqueting hall was a world of performance. Laughter echoed from men whose hands had taken lives that same morning. Minstrels sang of honor and mercy while roasted boars dripped blood onto trenchers. The Lord sat high at the dais, his favored knights and guests flanking him like polished statues, their goblets refilled before they ever emptied. The scent of roast venison, sugared plums, and crushed mint mingled with sweat, wine, and the faint trace of spilled ale. But behind all this, beneath the clink of goblets and the ring of song, was another rhythm, the movement of servants. Ilsa was among them, a food runner, assigned to the central path between the kitchen and the hall. She was fast, precise, silent when needed, and sharp when ignored. Her hands bore knife nicks and burned blisters. Her apron was always damp. Her name was rarely spoken by anyone at the tables, yet she could identify each noble by scent, boot tread, and appetite. Sir Torvin, who refused anything with garlic. Lady Esme, who demanded pomegranate seeds no matter the season. The visiting baron from the west, who tore his meat with his fingers and wiped them on the hems of his servants' tunics when he thought no one watched. Ilsa watched. She carried platters heavy with goose and quince, trencher loaves soaked in marrow and broth, pitchers of wine so dark they looked like ink. She learned to balance 3 goblets at once, to pivot without spilling, to smile politely while being ignored. The younger servants idolized the food runners. They moved the closest to the nobility, brushing shoulders with men in fox fur cloaks and women in pearl-threaded sleeves. But Ilsa knew better. Proximity didn't mean favor. It meant danger. A dropped plate could earn a beating. A wrong pour might mean dismissal. Once, a boy dropped a tray of glazed trout beside the steward's wife. He was gone before dawn. They said he had run off, but Ilsa saw the bruises on his neck the day before. She never asked questions. She just moved faster. Each banquet followed the same pattern. The bell rang at mid-afternoon, and the scullions began preparing the trenchers' flat rounds of hard bread to catch the juices from meats and sauces. By the time the second bell rang, the main dishes were being spit-turned and basted. A whole deer wrapped in rosemary and cloves, pigeons stuffed with hazelnuts. A swan, rarely served, but memorable for the silver circlet wrapped around its beak. By the third bell, the musicians arrived, tuning their lutes and fiddles. The food runners lined up, aprons pressed, hair tied back, arms bare for speed and heat resistance. Ilsa always wore a red ribbon around her wrist, a gift from a butcher's boy long gone. She didn't believe in charms, but it reminded her to move quickly and to remember herself when others tried to forget her. At the banquet's height, the hall was madness. More than 100 guests, 10 courses, 30 servants moving in rhythm, some carrying trays, others sweeping bones from beneath the tables, still others pouring wine, holding basins for hand washing, refilling candles. The air was thick with heat, smoke, perfume, and laughter that turned sharp at the edges. The wine made men cruel. It made women careless. And it made servants invisible. Ilsa once witnessed a lord slap his page so hard he knocked a pitcher across the floor. The boy bit his lip to avoid crying out. She stepped around the spill, placed a fresh goblet beside the lord without meeting his eye, and whispered to the page, "Breathe through your nose." It helped with the sting. It was the only thing she could do. The scraps at the end of the feast were a ritual of their own. Servants were allowed, once the hall was cleared, to gather what was left. Not the meat, unless it had fallen or grown cold. Not the sweetened fruits, unless they were bruised. But the trenchers, soaked and swollen, were theirs. Ilsa learned to nibble quickly before the steward came through with his boot, breaking apart what remained so none could hoard. She once managed to hide a slice of pear in her sleeve. She gave it to a scullery girl too small to reach the serving line. The girl cried, then curtsied. Cleaning took longer than feasting. Grease slicked the floor. Ale pooled beneath the benches. Candles melted into wax lakes across the tables. All of it had to be scrubbed before first light. The hall had to look untouched when the nobility woke. Ilsa often scrubbed till her knees bruised against stone, fingers raw from lye soap, arms aching from carrying the slop pails to the troughs. Sometimes she fell asleep with the goose fat still clinging to her skin. But there were moments quiet, rare, when the great hall was hers. When the fire had dimmed, the guests were gone, and the stone echoed with nothing but her footsteps. She would walk slowly then, just once, from the kitchen arch to the dais, past the goblets, past the benches, up to the Lord's chair, and there she would stand, not to sit, never to sit, but to see what they saw. The room from above, the place of command. Then, as always, she would turn and walk back into shadow. After a banquet, the castle did not sleep peacefully. It groaned beneath the weight of so many bodies, too much wine, too many lies, spilled as easily as gravy. No one spoke about afterward. The steward was pale for days, but no punishment was handed down. The feast was a mask. Behind it, truth curled like steam. One noble might flatter a rival at the high table, while having already bribed his cook to slip something into the meat. A cupbearer might be dismissed for merely glancing too long at a lady's laced bodice. Larger ones, from a pinch, a shove, or worse. The body became a ledger. It recorded what the steward did not. She used to tally them silently, a game to pass the hours as she scrubbed the tables. 7 bruises meant it had been a good banquet. Once, after a particularly successful gathering, a half-finished pear tart was left on the table. Ilse took one bite. Sweet, soft, still warm. It was the first time in years she had tasted anything meant for someone above her. No one confessed. The runners were punished as a group. The banqueting hall remained a place of beauty and brutality, of music and menace. It was a theater where everyone played a part. The nobles wore jewels. The servants wore bruises. Ilse spent the morning polishing spoons with vinegar, while her back throbbed from the switch. No one spoke of the tart again. She chewed slowly, eyes closed. For a brief moment, she imagined herself not as a servant, but as a guest. Any more than 10, and she'd whisper to herself not to cry. Children of the castle's upper ranks would dare each other to trip servants, to burn them with candle wax or whisper threats with their mouths hidden behind silver goblets. The wind slammed against the shutters like a drunken ghost. The candles sputtered. A minstrel's lute snapped mid-song. Yet still they ate. Her hands were shaking. He said he'd have my fingers cut, the girl whispered. Ilse took a small honeyed fig from her apron pocket and gave it to her. They ate in silence. A small kindness in a place where kindness was rationed thinner than ale. Ilse had been assigned to the wine. It was her task to ensure the goblets never emptied. She moved between men with swollen red faces and women whose laughter sounded more like teeth. Near the hearth, one of the younger maids dropped a jug. The wine spread like blood across the rushes. No one helped her. A knight kicked the jug aside and told a joke about witches. Ilse didn't laugh. The line between cruelty and entertainment was thin. The girl left quietly. No farewells, just silence. Ilse never learned her name. The nobles might have slumped in their feather beds, flushed and full, their laughter softened by velvet drapes. But the servants worked on. They scrubbed, hauled, polished, and sometimes buried what the night left behind. For a while, most banquets ended with song and spilled cider. Not all did. Ilse had seen the dark edge of these celebrations. Once, she helped carry a girl barefoot, bloodied, her apron torn out of the wine cellar after the guests had gone. There was an unspoken rule among the servants. Speak nothing of what you see once the sun goes down. Still the banquets continued. For politics, for alliances, for show. Every few weeks, a new reason emerged. A betrothal, a hunting victory, a visiting bishop. Ilse once caught a pewter plate before it hit the floor. She saved the boy carrying it from a beating, but he never thanked her. Gratitude was dangerous. Attention even more so. They went back to silence. And with each came the same demand for pageantry. The kitchen staff would wake before the first rooster call, slaughtering birds, rolling dough, plucking herbs. Spice was rationed like treasure. The scent of cloves or saffron signaled not just wealth, but dominance. One dish bowl stuffed with apples and leeks took an entire day to prepare. The Lord never touched it. He had filled himself on duck before it arrived. The servants learned to keep their faces blank, their hands nimble. They grew sharp-eyed, quick-footed. After each feast, Ilse would count the bruises. Small ones, from bumping into chairs. One winter, a storm howled outside as a feast carried on within. Later that night, once the fire had turned to coals and the guests had staggered to their rooms, Ilse found the same maid curled behind the kitchens. There were rare rewards, too. If the feast had pleased the Lord, the steward might toss down crusts or scraps for the runners. That illusion vanished by dawn. The next day, the steward found a stain on the high table. She kept moving, always, through feasts and fasts, through births, deaths, weddings, and betrayals. And Ilse, always walking between the tables, carried the weight of both. Chapter 13. The midwife's lantern. The drowsy historian now invites you to follow a flickering light down the back corridors of a medieval castle, where cries echo in the dark and a scent of blood mingles with rosemary. Not all labors in a castle involved scouring pots or bearing platters. Some involve life and death delivered behind tightly drawn curtains. It was Tamsin who was summoned weeks before the birth. Illness and childbirth were tangled together, treated with poultices and whispered prayers. The fires were kept high to encourage warmth and breath. Tamsin would direct the servants like a general boil water, too many, and infants wrapped in cloth too small to be named. But she bore that grief without words. She simply washed her hands, packed her satchel, and walked back to her cot until the next knock at her door. Fetch linens, hold the mother upright, now flat, now side. Sometimes it took hours. Children avoided her gaze, unsure whether she brought life or stole it. But the older women knew her value. That the scar on her arm was from a branding iron meant for thieves. She denied none of it. She simply showed up when called, did her work, and left the judgments to others. They brought her little offerings, dried berries, scraps of lace. A serving girl, barely 14, was in labor. The steward disapproved, muttering about discipline and shame, but he sent for Tamsin anyway. The child was breech. The girl screamed until her voice gave out. Tamsin worked by lantern light, soaked in sweat and blood. She reached inside with steady fingers, coaxed the tiny legs, twisted gently, whispered, "Come now, little one." And he came. No one touched the newborn until she had washed them in herb water. No wet nurse fed them until Tamsin had checked their mouth for cleft or tongue tie. She named him Bram, after the old word for thicket, because he had pushed through against all odds. A single, quiet offering for a woman who had seen more lives begin and end than any priest in the chapel above. She placed him in the care of a Baron cook who had once been her apprentice. Years later, Bram would become a page, then a squire. He never knew who had pulled him into the world. She wrapped them in clean wool, anointed their heads with rosemary and salt, and whispered the old blessing in a tongue forgotten by the priests. She said it helped the soul remember its path. Once even a bottle of wine hidden beneath a cloak. No one spoke of her visits. It was understood. Tamsin never repeated a name. Sometimes days. Sometimes the screams stopped too soon. Tamsin kept no records. But she remembered every child she'd caught, every mother she'd held through the screaming. Tamsin was summoned in the dead of night. When births went well, the castle erupted in celebration. A noble heir meant songs, wine, roasted oxen, and gifts for every servant. Tamsin would be dressed in borrowed finery for a night, made to sit at the edge of the dais while the lady, still pale and shaking, gave her thanks. She smiled politely. But her eyes never left the child. No torchlight, no gossip, only silence. The child did not live. The girl did. Tamsin whispered something to her as she bled into the sheets, and by morning the bed was clean. The Lord never asked who had cleaned it, nor did he speak of his daughter's sudden trip to a convent 3 counties away. She carried those memories like stones in her apron, quiet, heavy, never shown. She would sleep on a rush mat outside the ladies' chamber, her lantern always lit beside her. Servants would bring her broth and cloth, and sometimes the lady's maid would sit with her in silence, knowing the pains would come soon. But it wasn't only nobles who needed her. Scullery girls, laundresses, and the daughters of stable hands would find her too. Slipping into her corner behind the kitchens when the signs first stirred, she never turned them away. Witnessed only by the women who moved silently between chambers, clutching baskets of linen and bowls of steaming herbs. Among these figures, one stood apart, the midwife. Her name was Tamsin. She was not a servant in typical sense. She was not bound by the steward's roster or paid in bread and barley. Yet she served more intimately than most, moving through the lives of noble and lowborn alike, called at odd hours by desperate hands and frantic whispers. She came with her lantern, her long fingers, her bundle of dried yarrow and old bone-handled knife. And she came without judgment. When a noble woman grew heavy with child, the castle had no infirmary for women. She had her rituals. A silver coin placed beneath the mattress, a sprig of mugwort tied to the left bedpost, a drop of honey on the mother's tongue during the worst of the pain. Some scoffed, especially the castle chaplain, who muttered about superstition and heretics. But he never came near the birthing room. And when the lady of the castle delivered a son after 2 stillbirths, he was among the first to kiss Tamsin's hand. The birthing rooms themselves were grim, hot places, filled with moans and prayers. The windows were shuttered to keep out spirits. She had buried mothers. Among the servants, she was respected and feared. Once, a noble lord's youngest daughter grew round with child. No banns were posted. No suitor was announced. But not all of Tamsin's work was cloaked in secrecy. She had rules. Of course, not everyone welcomed her. There were whispers that she had once been a hedge witch, that she had a husband who vanished in the bogs. One winter, during a bitter frost, Tamsin was called to the lower dormitories. The mother did not survive. Tamsin wrapped the boy herself, held him until dawn. But every year, on the darkest night of winter, he left a sprig of mugwort on the windowsill of the midwife's chamber. The castle never truly slept, not even in the hush that followed childbirth. Somewhere, something always stirred. A guard's boots echoing on stone, a dog barking in the kennels, the soft shuffle of mice in the grain stores. Yet within Tamsin's small chamber, nestled beside the herb garden wall, there existed a kind of stillness that even the clamor of the outer world could not pierce. The midwife had made it so. She'd lined the room with dried bundles of lavender, angelica, and rue, the air thick with their mingled fragrance. Clay jars lined her shelves, moss salve, willow bark tincture, powdered charcoal, lamb's fat rendered down to soft ointment. Every bottle, every cloth, every bone spoon had its place. In the quiet, she was a sovereign of shadows. Servants came to her not only for births, but for all the private ailments they could not speak of elsewhere. Cramping bellies, blood that would not stop, fevers that gripped during moonrise, minds that frayed at the edges during storms. Tamsin listened without interruption. She asked for no payment beyond what they could offer. A handful of beans, a warm crust of bread, a polished button from an old coat. She brewed her teas with care, poured them slowly, and never rushed anyone out. Some would cry when they drank. She let them. There was a ledger hidden under her mattress, not of debts, but of names. Every child she had caught, every mother who had breathed their last in her arms. She wrote their names in ink when she knew them, in charcoal when she didn't. She would read the list aloud once a year, on the night the first frost settled, lighting a beeswax candle that burned low and slow. To remember, she would murmur. So someone remembers. One autumn, a strange illness crept into the castle. It started with aches and turned to sweats, then to silence. 3 maids died within a week. The chaplain declared it a punishment, called for fasting and confession. The steward ordered stronger vinegar for the floors and removed the rushes from every chamber. Tamsin, however, boiled valerian and pine resin, smeared juniper paste on lintels, and whispered for the walls to hold strong. She wrapped her nose and mouth in linen and kept her hands scrubbed raw. Only one more died after that. Many whispered it was her doing not luck or prayer, but her herbs, her presence. She never answered those whispers. She had no apprentice now. The last girl she trained had married a Fletcher's son and moved to the village. The castle's young ones were too afraid or too eager to work in the kitchens, where steam and onions at least offered predictability. The truth was, no one wanted to sit beside a dying woman for 10 hours, or wash blood from wool sheets by torchlight. So Tamsin worked alone, moving slower now, her joints stiffening as the years pressed down. Still, she answered every knock, day or night. Still, her lantern burned. Some knights mocked her under their breath, called her crone, hedge hag, whisper wife, but they did not laugh when their own wives went into labor. They sent for her with coins and wine and wide-eyed panic. She would arrive, silent and precise, and leave just as swiftly, a bundle in one arm and a weary mother behind her, often too weak to speak thanks. Gratitude wasn't required. Tamsin did not serve for favor. She had dreams often strange, sometimes warm. Once she dreamed of a room filled with all the children she'd caught into the world. Some held flowers, some held wooden swords, others held nothing but silence. She awoke crying, though she could not say why. Another time she dreamed of the first woman she'd helped give birth, her own mother, slick with sweat and laughter. That child hadn't lived, neither had her mother. That dream was quieter. More final. It was near midwinter when she was called by a maidservant with an urgent message. A noble woman, young in her 7th month, had begun labor too early. Tamsin arrived to find the woman ghost pale, her belly tight with fear. The husband, barely older than the bride, stood in the corner wringing his hands. Tamsin waved him out. Men brought more trouble than help in such moments. The birth was rough. The child came feet first, too small, slick with fluid and silence. Tamsin worked quickly, breathing into the child's mouth, rubbing its chest, swaddling it in hot cloths. A weak cry broke the air like glass. The mother wept. The steward brought a goblet of mulled wine and offered it to Tamsin with trembling fingers. She declined. The child lived. The mother too. For days afterward they sent warm food to her chamber, and the noble woman insisted she be named the child's godmother. Tamsin refused politely. "Let him belong to your house," she said. "Not mine." But she kept the embroidered cloth the baby had been wrapped in. A small thing. A memory. She thought often about retiring, leaving the castle, building a cottage near the edge of the forest where she could grow herbs and speak only to bees. But she knew the castle would come knocking again. It always did, and she could not ignore a knock. She never had. One night, long after the bells had rung, a knock did come. Not frantic, gentle, measured. She opened the door to find a boy no older than 10, barefoot, eyes wide with worry. His mother, a kitchen hand, had collapsed during her supper. He didn't know what to do. Tamsin followed without a word, her lantern swinging, light slicing through the black. She worked until morning, and when the sun rose, the castle kitchen smelled not of soot and onions, but of sage, wet wool, and blood. Another life had been saved, another name to write. Tamsin returned to her chamber, closed the door, lit her small candle, and sat beside the ledger. Her hand shook slightly. She dipped the nib into the inkpot, opened to a fresh page, and wrote, "Alice, daughter of Gwen, born beneath frost. Warm breath, steady heart. All is well." Then she closed the book and let the lantern burn. Chapter 14. Dust, Death, and the Bell Tower. The drowsy historian leads you now to the highest shadowed perch of the castle, the bell tower. It was a place few servants ventured unless they were summoned, punished, or tasked with work so thankless no other soul would claim it. Here, beneath crumbling beams and cold winds that hissed through arrow slits, dust gathered thick enough to choke, and birds roosted undisturbed, leaving their droppings on holy stone. Yet still, someone had to keep it. Someone had to climb the spiral stairs, polish the bronze tongue of the bell, sweep the pigeon bones, and wind the rope for the next death knell or daybreak toll. In the quiet kingdom of dust and echoes, that someone was Aldrich. Aldrich had not always been a tower keeper. He once tended the stables, then the hounds, then the kitchens. But each time some accident, some misstep, some streak of ill luck left him reassigned, until he was quietly ordered to take the tower for good. Most called him strange. He spoke little, walked with a limp from a fall on the north stair, and kept his hair cropped too close to the scalp, as if to show the scar behind his ear. But he never refused a task, never complained, and so the bell became his. The tower rose above the great hall like a finger pointing skyward, its base thick with ivy, its crown wrapped in wind. The steps were narrow, uneven, and slick with centuries of wear. Climbing them was like ascending a spine made of stone. Aldrich made the journey 3 times each day, morning, noon, and evening. At dawn, he rang the wake bell, a low echoing groan that stirred the baker, the guards, the kitchen staff. At midday, he struck the bell twice for prayer, and at night once more to mark the castle's closing. But he also rang for death. When someone died within the castle walls, Aldrich tolled the bell once for each year the soul had walked the earth. The servants whispered that he had memorized the ages of everyone inside, that he could recall the birth date of every guard and scullery maid. No one ever corrected him. Once, after the death of a young page, Aldrich rang 15 times. The boy's mother, a laundress, wept into her apron and whispered he was 14. The steward merely replied, "Then he must have lived fuller than we knew." The bell itself was old bronze, cast with Latin script along its lip, its clapper worn smooth by centuries of tolling. Birds nested in the beams above it, moss clung to the corners. Aldrich scrubbed it twice a month with vinegar and straw, dragging buckets up the stair with creaking ropes and stiff fingers. The work gave him blisters even after years. But he did it with reverence. To him, the bell was not just a tool. It was the castle's voice. From his perch, he saw everything: the comings and goings at the main gate, the smoke rising from the smithy, the way shadows crept across the training yard as seasons changed. He saw lovers meet by the stables, arguments near the well, the slow pageant of life played out below without ever being part of it. He watched without judgment, just as the bell tolled without favor. His chamber was tucked just beneath the bell's mouth, a round, narrow room with a slanted ceiling and a single slit window. It held a cot, a stool, a shelf of broken tools, and a ledger in which he recorded each toll. Not by name, only by date, hour, and number of chimes. Sometimes he would sit by candlelight, flipping through the worn pages, listening to the wind batter the stones outside. He knew the rhythm of death well. There were winters when the pages filled quickly, summers when nothing stirred. The bell's silence during those days was almost heavier than its sound. One bitter evening, snow flurries twisting like ash, Aldrich was called to toll the bell for a knight who had died of fever. The man was arrogant in life, disliked by many, cruel to most. But Aldrich rang 47 times without pause. He did not judge. Afterward, a maid approached him quietly, pressing a dried fig into his palm. "He beat my sister," she whispered. "But thank you." Aldrich nodded, said nothing, and returned to the tower. The bell could be heard as far as the forest's edge, carried on the wind like a chant. Farmers set their watches by it. Villagers counted its tolls to guess who might have passed. It was a language beyond words, one the castle spoke to its surroundings, a voice older than any banner or decree. But there were moments of silence, too. Times when Aldrich would climb the stairs not to ring, but simply to sit. On moonless nights, he would light no candle, speaking only in breath. He once wrote in the margin of his ledger, "This tower has heard more prayers than the chapel below, and none of them from lips." He had once dreamed of being a priest, but life had taken a different turn, and now he served in a higher chapel of stone and sky. His only companion was a cat-thin, gray, and mean-eyed, who came and went as it pleased. He called her Smoke. She slept on his cot in the cold months and disappeared in spring. He never fed her, yet she always returned. One year, a great storm battered the coast. Wind howled through the tower slits, lifting roof tiles, flinging open shutters. The bell swung wild in its housing, groaning with each gust. Aldrich braced it with rope, arms trembling, knowing if it fell, he'd fall too. It didn't. In the days that followed, as servants rebuilt ladders and patched leaks, Aldrich repaired the housing himself, alone, without instruction. When asked why he hadn't waited for carpenters, he replied simply, "She must keep her voice." To him, the bell was feminine, patient, watchful. He had no wife, no child, no family name that meant anything. But he had the bell, and it was enough. Chapter 14, Dust, Death, and the Bell Tower. When winter faded into spring and the bell tower's stone began to sweat with morning dew, Aldrich would oil the rope, polish the clapper, and mark another year passed in silence. His ledger grew fatter with ink and dust. He kept the pages wrapped in oilskin and bound with twine, though no one had ever asked to read them. Sometimes he imagined that centuries from now, someone would open that record, run their fingers across the columns of dates and toll counts, and wonder about the unnamed souls those numbers represented. He found comfort in the idea that memory could be preserved even when names were lost. There were times when the steward sent boys up to help him. New pages in training, punishments, usually. Most didn't last. They complained of the cold, of the pigeons, of the vertigo from looking down. One lad nearly vomited when a dead crow slid from the eaves and landed beside him. Another wept when the wind howled through the narrow slits like a screaming woman. Aldrich never scolded them. He simply handed them a broom or a coil of rope and pointed toward the corner where the ivy crept through the cracks. But the tower had a way of shaking loose anything not meant to stay. Within days, the boys would vanish from his ledgers as quickly as they appeared. Except for Thomlin. Thomlin was a baker's nephew, small for his age, but with quick hands and quicker questions. He arrived one summer afternoon, sweating and wide-eyed, holding a broom taller than himself. "They said I was too slow kneading dough," he muttered when Aldrich asked why he'd been sent. Aldrich shrugged. "Then sweep like you're sweeping flour." And Thomlin did. Day after day, he climbed the steps, panting, wiping sweat with his tunic sleeve, sweeping dust, asking about the bell. "Why do we ring it 13 times for a dead guard, but 40 for a night? How do you know when the sun is up if it's cloudy? Why does the wind sound like wolves up here?" Aldrich rarely answered, but he didn't send the boy away either. Over time, Thomlin began copying from the ledger, practicing his letters. He started adding small notes in the margins. "Lady in blue veil, child born under rain, died before supper." Aldrich pretended not to notice, though once, after Thomlin had gone, he traced the boy's crooked handwriting with his finger and allowed himself the faintest smile. The tower softened then, in that strange way places do when they are shared. Thomlin brought bread crusts to feed the pigeons, who began roosting closer. He tied little scraps of cloth to the railing, each representing someone he'd lost: a grandmother, a dog, a friend who drowned in the moat. Aldrich said nothing, but one morning added a scrap of his own, dark wool, rough and old. Thomlin didn't ask whose memory it honored. He simply nodded and added another beside it. Then came the day the boy didn't arrive. The steward came instead, face drawn, steps slow. "The fever took him in the night," he said. "Didn't suffer long." Aldrich said nothing, just nodded, turned away, and began climbing the stairs. He rang the bell 12 times. For the first time in years, he let his hand linger on the clapper after the final toll, as if trying to hold the sound in the air a moment longer. The pigeons scattered. The wind fell still. Beneath his breath, he whispered Thomlin's name and added it to the ledger with shaking hands. Below the count, he wrote, "The tower remembers." Days passed, then weeks. Aldrich kept the tower, but something shifted in him. He walked slower, his sweeping less precise. He spent longer staring out over the ramparts, eyes unfocused, fingers curled around the rope without pulling. People noticed. The steward offered to assign a new boy. Aldrich declined. The tower, he said, wasn't ready. That autumn, on the eve of All Souls' Night, Aldrich climbed the tower at dusk. He lit a candle for every life he had ever tolled the bell for. The chamber filled with flickering light, the air heavy with wax and smoke. He opened the ledger, page by page, and read each entry aloud. Not the names, he rarely had them, but the tolls, the dates, the sounds. 7 bells, April frost. Girl with a lark pin. 10 bells, midsummer. Boy who laughed while sweeping. He read until the wax burned down, until the stone glowed golden, until the silence was thick with memory. Then he closed the book. The next morning, when the wake bell did not sound, the steward sent a guard to investigate. They found Aldrich on his stool, head resting gently against the bell's base, hands folded in his lap, eyes closed. A faint smile on his face. The wind had not blown. The pigeons had not cried. The bell had stayed silent. He was buried beneath the tower wall, not far from where the ivy crept along the base. There was no grand ceremony. Just a few servants who remembered his silence, his strength, his devotion. The steward placed the ledger beside him, wrapped in cloth. The chaplain muttered the usual prayers. But it was the cook's daughter, barely 9, who stood beside the grave and whispered, "He rang the bell when my gran passed." He made it sound kind. The castle appointed another tower keeper. But the bell rang differently after that. Sharper, colder. Servants said it was the wind. Others said it was simply the way of things. But some, especially the older ones, claimed that on misty mornings, you could still see a figure seated beneath the bell, cat curled at his feet, ledger open on his knee. And if you listened very closely, in the silence between chimes, you could hear a voice say, "The tower remembers." Chapter 12, Banquet Scraps and Bitter Wine. The drowsy historian now takes you into the castle's great hall, not during the silence of sleep, but at its loudest, liveliest, and most dangerous during a feast. For all the gilded candlesticks, velvet cushions, silver platters, and roaring fires. Few ever speak of the unseen figures darting behind the scenes. The ones with aching feet, raw fingers, soot-streaked foreheads, and no right to sit, to taste, or to rest. To be a servant during a medieval banquet was to witness splendor from the shadows, to stand within reach of power and yet belong to none of it. The banqueting hall was a world performance. Laughter echoed from men whose hands had taken lives that same morning. Minstrels sang of honor and mercy while roasted boars dripped blood onto trenchers. The Lord sat high at the dais, his favored knights and guests flanking him like polished statues, their goblets refilled before they ever emptied. The scent of roast venison, sugared plums, and crushed mint mingled with sweat, wine, and the faint trace of spilled ale. But behind all this, beneath the clink of goblets and the ring of song, was another rhythm, the movement of servants. Ilsa was among them, a food runner, assigned to the central path between the kitchen and the hall. She was fast, precise, silent when needed, and sharp when ignored. Her hands bore knife nicks and burned blisters. Her apron was always damp. Her name was rarely spoken by anyone at the tables, yet she could identify each noble by scent, boot tread, and appetite. Sir Torvin, who refused anything with garlic. Lady Esme, who demanded pomegranate seeds no matter the season. The visiting baron from the west, who tore his meat with his fingers and wiped them on the hems of his servants' tunics when he thought no one watched. Ilsa watched. She carried platters heavy with goose and quince, trencher loaves soaked in marrow and broth, pitchers of wine so dark they looked like ink. She learned to balance 3 goblets at once, to pivot without spilling, to smile politely while being ignored. The younger servants idolized the food runners. They moved the closest to the nobility, brushing shoulders with men in fox fur cloaks and women in pearl-threaded sleeves. But Ilsa knew better. Proximity didn't mean favor. It meant danger. A dropped plate could earn a beating. A wrong pour might mean dismissal. Once, a boy dropped a tray of glazed trout beside the steward's wife. He was gone before dawn. They said he had run off, but Ilsa saw the bruises on his neck the day before. She never asked questions. She just moved faster. Each banquet followed the same pattern. The bell rang at mid-afternoon, and the scullions began preparing the trenchers, flat rounds of hard bread to catch the juices from meats and sauces. By the time the second bell rang, the main dishes were being spit-turned and basted. A whole deer wrapped in rosemary and cloves, pigeons stuffed with hazelnuts. A swan, rarely served, but memorable for the silver circlet wrapped around its beak. By the third bell, the musicians arrived, tuning their lutes and fiddles. The food runners lined up, aprons pressed, hair tied back, arms bare for speed and heat resistance. Ilsa always wore a red ribbon around her wrist, a gift from a butcher's boy long gone. She didn't believe in charms, but it reminded her to move quickly and to remember herself when others tried to forget her. At the banquet's height, the hall was madness. More than 100 guests, 10 courses, 30 servants moving in rhythm, some carrying trays, others sweeping bones from beneath the tables, still others pouring wine, holding basins for hand washing, refilling candles. The air was thick with heat, smoke, perfume, and laughter that turned sharp at the edges. The wine made men cruel. It made women careless. And it made servants invisible. Ilsa once witnessed a lord slap his page so hard he knocked a pitcher across the floor. The boy bit his lip to avoid crying out. She stepped around the spill, placed a fresh goblet beside the lord without meeting his eye, and whispered to the page, "Breathe through your nose." It helped with the sting. It was the only thing she could do. The scraps at the end of the feast were a ritual of their own. Servants were allowed, once the hall was cleared, to gather what was left. Not the meat, unless it had fallen or grown cold. Not the sweetened fruits, unless they were bruised. But the trenchers, soaked and swollen, were theirs. Ilsa learned to nibble quickly before the steward came through with his boot, breaking apart what remained so none could hoard. She once managed to hide a slice of pear in her sleeve. She gave it to a scullery girl too small to reach the serving line. The girl cried, then curtsied. Cleaning took longer than feasting, Grease slicked the floor. Ale pooled beneath the benches. Candles melted into wax lakes across the tables. All of it had to be scrubbed before first light. The hall had to look untouched when the nobility woke. Ilsa often scrubbed till her knees bruised against stone, fingers raw from lye soap, arms aching from carrying the slop pails to the troughs. Sometimes she fell asleep with the goose fat still clinging to her skin. But there were moments quiet, rare, when the great hall was hers. When the fire had dimmed, the guests were gone, and the stone echoed with nothing but her footsteps. She would walk slowly then, just once, from the kitchen arch to the dais, past the goblets, past the benches, up to the Lord's chair, and there she would stand, not to sit, never to sit, but to see what they saw. The room from above, the place of command. Then, as always, she would turn and walk back into shadow.